And now is a time when things are shifting. There's gonna be a new world order out there.
Well, he's dead, so
My fellow Americans, I've said on several occasions that I wouldn't comment about the recent congressional hearings on the Iran-Contra matter.
Welcome everyone to the show. You guys can now hear us, and that's the important part. We had a few technical difficulties. It will be a better experience this time around. So, as I started the show, I met Mr. Marcus a couple of weeks ago. We did a show on the moon landings. It was a terrific show. And after that show, Marcus and I stayed on the line for about 45 minutes, dropping more truth bombs, wishing I had recorded that show. But no worries. We are here and we will be getting more truth bombs for sure. For those that may have missed it, though, Mr. Allen, you were in the middle of telling us who you were, and then we had those technical difficulties. If you don't mind telling us again and reminding us a little bit of your background, please.
Yeah, let's just do a brief resume. As you can see, I've been around the block a few times, and I started the rabbit hole adventures, diving down them, back, 60 years ago, when I came across a book called Morning of the Magicians. It's still available now. It's a very famous book because it was really the first book. It was written by a couple of French authors, Bergier and Paulus, and they recounted a lot of things which they had been investigating. 5 years later, I came across Eric von Daniken's book, Chariots of the Gods. But before that, I'd driven a Land Rover to India. That was the first thing I did. I was in a job which I didn't particularly like because I didn't like the way the company was run. So I resigned and thought, well, what the hell do I do now? I was 19 years old. I saw an advertisement in the London Times, which carried personal advertisements on their front page back in those days. And it said there were two people driving to India, and they wanted a third to help share the expenses. So I volunteered. And there were 35 people who answered that advertisement. I was the one who selected. 19 years old, so I was the easiest to order around, I discovered later. Anyway, they were good friends. We drove to India. Took about 3 months to do that. Fantastic trip. Anybody wants to do something like that? Not possible today, unfortunately. You wouldn't get permission to drive across Iran. You wouldn't get permission to drive through Pakistan, which is where we went. So you'd have to go through Kazakhstan, which I couldn't do at the time. Anyway, I drove to India, spent a year in India, teaching English at a school in Calcutta. And during the school holidays, I traveled around India, went up to see sunrise over Everest from the Sandakphu Ridge near Darjeeling. I drove the Land Rover into Kathmandu in Nepal, the third civilian vehicle ever to drive into Nepal. This is a long time ago, guys. I mean, it sounds odd now. And also went up to Kashmir, did some water skiing in Kashmir. How many people have been to Kashmir? Have you even seen it? It's a lovely place. It's a really beautiful place. And if things calm down a bit, hopefully they will, take a look at Kashmir. It's a really beautiful place to visit. Once you get there, it's quite a long way away. It's northwest corner of India. They're fighting over it. India and Pakistan are still fighting over it. Anyway, so I did a lot of traveling around, came back to the UK via Beirut, those were the days when if you knocked on the captain's door of the Boeing 707 I was traveling back in, "Hello, Captain, can I come and watch you land the plane?" "Yes, come in, here's a spare seat," he said. That's what it was like back in the 60s. So I watched them land the plane at Beirut Airport. Fantastic. There's a whole mountains behind the airport, so I had to slow down pretty fast. Anyway, spent a week in Beirut, had a lovely time there. Stayed at the George V Hotel. I don't think it exists anymore. And then came back via Istanbul, where I bought myself a nice leather jacket. Got back to the UK just in time for Christmas. What do I do now? So I'd taken a lot of photographs during my trip around India, so I thought, I know, I'll go to photographic college and learn what I should be doing. I didn't want to know what photographs to take. I was fully confident of being able to do that. I just wanted to know the technical side of photography. So I spent 2 years studying photography in London. Wonderful time in the 60s. Worked in photographic studios, worked for advertising agencies, worked for people who understand photography. And I understood photography. I'd used the camera I just subsequently discovered was used on the moon, the Hasselblad camera. Very good camera. Built like a Swiss watch. But it's a brilliant camera. It took great photographs. And the reason it took great photographs is because it had a very, very good lens made by the Zeiss company, who at the time were based in what was then East Germany, to the east of Berlin. So I spent time there. I had a lovely time. Spent 5 years working in photography, you're doing a lot of darkroom work, producing photographs. This is before the days of digital cameras. This is what we were using, photographic film. And that became a very important aspect of what I subsequently discovered about the Apollo hoax. Photographic film was what was used then. We'll discuss the problems with that in a minute, I'm sure. So having spent time in London, I'd married, I got family. We thought we'd better move out of London. So I moved to East Grinstead, south of London, about 30 miles south of London, near Gatwick Airport. And I've spent the last 50 plus years in East Grinstead, doing various jobs. I worked for Toyota, the car importers. I still drive a Toyota today. One day about 30 years ago, they said, "Oh, here's a big check. We don't need you anymore. It's called being made redundant." So I had a big check. I'd come across a magazine at the time, magazine which you may be familiar with, Nexus magazine. Found it was Australian and thought, well, let's go out to Australia and visit the editor and see if he wants us to distribute the magazine in the UK. So we did. It was our 25th wedding anniversary. Went out to Australia, met up with Duncan Rhodes, who's the editor and publisher of Nexus. And he said, "Yeah, good on you, mate. Here's a few to start you off with." So I landed back at Heathrow with 50K of luggage. And how do you sell magazines? Well, you go to places where they sell magazines, which I did. I drove around the UK and went to various bookshops and agents and said, "Do you want to sell this magazine?" They said, "We'll give it a go." Anyway, that was 30 odd years ago, and it's progressed ever since as being a successful magazine. And you should read Nexus. Go into Barnes & Noble in the US, they sell it there. Or you can contact the website, nexusmagazine.com, and you can get a digital subscription or a hard copy subscription, if that's your preference. It's available, it's been available now for over 35 years, and it's considered to be one of the most informative alternative news magazines available. Many have come and gone, but Nexus has continued. So I got involved with Nexus. I've been involved in that for over 30 years now. And it's been a great adventure. I've met some wonderful people, gone to some incredible events, UFO events, like the Glastonbury Symposium, where you get speakers who are interested in, shall we say, non-mainstream subjects. So glastonburysymposium.co.uk will give you the information about that. Anybody wants to come over to the UK, you're very welcome to turn up at the Glastonbury Symposium. Anyway, I got involved in that right at the beginning, and we support the symposium and Nexus. We've sold it there. We sell it in a lot of different places around the country. It's sold on, would you believe, W.H. Smith, which is the equivalent of Barnes and Noble in the UK, main outlet for magazines. And it's been going very well. And one of the things we've looked at is the moon landings. As I say, I came across that the first time I heard about it possibly not being real was in Glastonbury, at the Glastonbury Symposium about 30 years ago. When one of the speakers there, who was actually an American, speaking about megaliths, so it wasn't anything to do with the moon landings, but as an aside during his talk, he was showing lots of pictures of megaliths and such like. He said, well, of course, you've seen the photographs of the moon landing. They're not real, they're faked. And I thought, what an idiot. How can he say that? Because I'd watched it. I watched it live when it happened, July 20th, 1969. One small step for man, one small giant leap for mankind. All that stuff. I watched it. Waved out the window at the moon. I thought maybe they'll be watching. I don't know. And they weren't. So I'd been involved, and I thought, I was a big enthusiast for space travel. I liked the stories. I read science fiction stories which involved space travel, obviously, but they were fiction. They weren't science, they were fiction, but it was fascinating stuff. But the moon landings were for real. They really got there. And I thought, wow, incredible. Anyway, he mentioned the photographs as being dubious. And I thought, I'll check them out, I'll have a look. And I looked at several, because at the time, this is before the internet had come into force at all, early 90s. I thought I had to go out to an astronomy show and buy a set of postcards of the moon landings. I thought, oh, that's interesting. I had a look at the pictures. Specifically, there are only 5 pictures I had in my set. And one of them was the famous one of Buzz Aldrin standing on the lunar surface. It's known as the man on the moon photograph, because there he is, man on the moon. I had a look at it and I thought, I can see there's a few problems here. It's all to do with the way the light falls on the subject, and not so much how the light falls, but how that light is recorded in the camera. That's the key point, because we're talking about photographic film here. This stuff is a photographic film. This is 35mm film. The Hasselblad used 70mm, about twice the size of that. You get much more detail. So we got all that, and I thought, okay, I'll have a look at some of the other pictures. And I looked at a few of them, and specifically the one of, as I discovered later, Buzz Aldrin climbing down the ladder from the Apollo 11 lander, the Eagle, climbing down the ladder. And you can see he's lit up like a Christmas tree. You can see all the detail you want to see in his spacesuit. But he's in the shadow of the lander. He's in darkness. On the moon, there's no atmosphere. If the sun shines, it's bright. If it doesn't shine, it's dark. So I thought, hang on a minute. How can you get clear images of an astronaut climbing down a ladder in darkness when the surface of the moon, I presume that's what they were trying to tell us it was, the surface of the moon was not overexposed in the camera? And I know how accurate you have to get photographs exposed. You've got to get the aperture correct, the focus obviously correct, and the shutter speed correct. And if they're not correct, the photograph is ruined. You've got to take another one. But they didn't take another one. They took one picture of Buzz Aldrin. Well, no, they took 8 altogether. There's a sequence of 8 photographs. If you go onto any website which shows the Apollo 11 magazine 40, that's what it is, magazine 40 photographs, you can see there are 8 photographs in sequence of him kneeling in the doorway, on the porch of the lander, 2 of him on the ladder and 1 standing at the base. But interspersed with those pictures, obviously Neil Armstrong, who was taking the photographs, got bored watching Buzz Aldrin coming down and turned his camera 90 degrees to the side to photograph the rubbish bag, which they had thrown out of the lander, allegedly, underneath the lander. And then a picture, this is Armstrong taking the pictures. Armstrong then photographed one of the legs of the lander, presumably to see if it was damaged. They're quite what they'd have done if it had been damaged. History doesn't relate, because there's no motor recovery service on the moon. You've got to fix it yourself. And then he takes another picture of Buzz Aldrin on the ladder. So he's got to alter the aperture, the focus, and the shutter speed, because this is not a point and shoot camera. The Hasselblad camera, the only automatic feature on the camera used on the moon, we're told, is the automatic film advance. You press the shutter, which, by the way, you can't see from inside your spacesuit, because it's on the front of the camera. So they've got a big button to press, assuming you see it or feel it. You couldn't feel it through your gloves. So you've got all these problems. You can't use a viewfinder because you can't get your head down. The viewfinder on a Hasselblad is on top of the camera. You don't look through the camera, you look down onto it. If you're wearing a spacesuit with a full face motorcycle helmet equivalent, you can't get your head close enough to use it. So they didn't use it, it was taken away. So without a viewfinder, wearing what were in effect heavy duty gardening gloves, you had to operate this camera. The shutter button you couldn't see because it's the other side from where you are. You've got to operate the control rings. They're quite small control rings, so they put little paddles on them so that you could push them with your finger, but you then couldn't see what you'd set it at. You couldn't see the aperture settings, f5.6, f8, f11, f16. You couldn't see the shutter speed at 160th, 125th, 250th, 500. You couldn't see those from inside the helmet. So how did they get such beautifully exposed, beautifully composed, accurately focused photographs using those with those restrictions of the use of the camera? And I still haven't got the answer to that. So if anybody out there has used the Hasselblad camera without a view, you could take a photograph without a viewfinder, that's not a problem. A lot of people do. But it's to get it accurate. And if you're using a polarizing filter, which shuts out some of the reflections, if you're using a polarizing filter, you have to use a viewfinder to see if you've got the polarizing filter accurately set. So you've got all these restrictions on use, the gloves, not being able to see half the things you need to see, and a camera that is beautifully made. There's no question about that. We haven't even discussed the worst problem that it's going to have on the moon, which is the vacuum. Guess what? The moon is in a vacuum. There's no atmosphere. There's nothing there. That's what a vacuum is. There's nothing there. On the moon is a vacuum. What happens to photographic film, this stuff, when it's placed in a vacuum? What happens to it? It outgasses. The plastic backing of a film carries the light-sensitive emulsion coated onto the film, and that light-sensitive emulsion started life as a liquid. It's very carefully constructed, but it was still a liquid. What happens to a liquid in a vacuum? It outgasses. It always does. That's because if there isn't enough pressure, the lighter elements in the whatever medium it is, it can be aluminium, it can be photographic film, it can be anything, it will outgas because there isn't enough pressure to hold everything in. The lighter elements in this case, the light sensitive emulsion, is outgassed. The helium, the hydrogen, the oxygen, they're all light elements and they just drift off, they float off because there's nothing holding them down. So photographic film, which we have actually tested in a vacuum chamber, albeit not at the same hardness of vacuum that you would find on the moon, we have tested it in a vacuum, and the first thing you notice about photographic film after it's been in a vacuum is the color balance of the film is shot to pieces. The blues aren't blue, the greens aren't green, the reds aren't red, nor is any other color correct. And we demonstrated that. Put a film in a vacuum chamber, take it out, put it in a camera, take photographs with it and see the result. And the results are not acceptable. But every single one of the 5,771 photographs taken on the lunar surface, as you can go and see on any of the half dozen websites which carry them, or the Flickr account, NASA's Flickr account, which carries them, the colors are accurate. The American flag has the red and white stripes. It has blue background. Those are accurate colors. And they say, well, we got accurate colors because we carried a color chart with us to the moon. Yes, they did. You can see them. They're little strips with varying colors. And that's how they were supposed to get the colors right. But they didn't solve the problem of the vacuum. So all the films taken, if they were taken on the lunar surface, would not have worked. Digital cameras, however, are quite different. They don't carry photographic film, they use electronics. And a digital camera will record things very differently to a film camera. So let's not have any arguments about, well, they took digital cameras. They didn't. They weren't invented until 1975, after Apollo was dead and gone. They used film cameras, a Hasselblad film camera. They also used film cameras. There's a 16mm Maurer film camera, but most of the activity that you see on the moon was recorded by, and those were brought back to America and processed in America, as were all the photographic films from the Hasselblad camera. They're now stored in the Johnson Space Center, so-called Johnson Space Center, named after President L.B. Johnson, who was Senator for Texas, who was the man responsible for a lot of the activities in Texas to do with the space program, because he had control of the money. Well done, Texas. Got it right there.
And his buddy, Mr. John F. Kennedy. I'm sure. Yeah, it's truly fascinating when you really go down this rabbit hole. There's so many angles, paths you can take. I joined a group in Facebook that's Flat Earth versus global guys. And I joined it just to see what the arguments were and see what this was all about. Turns out most of them are people that believe in a spheroid Earth. There are very, very few flat earthers, and when they make a comment, they get jumped on by everyone else. And there's about 8,000 folks in there.
Really?
And I just made a comment. I went in there and I go, okay, I don't know what the Earth is, but let's say it's a sphere. I don't believe the NASA moon landings. How many people in here believe the NASA moon landings? Holy smokes.
Cool.
That really, really angered everyone. They started saying this and attacking me this. And I got thick skin, so none of it bothered me at all. I just answered back and I go, okay, what about this? What about that? And it was just angering them even more. And what I quickly figured out is a lot of people are emotionally attached to the whole moon landings. You present facts. I did present your arguments about film in a vacuum, and they have no answers. They just have ad hominem attacks, and that's usually a sign that they've lost the argument, because they're not providing anything of substance. They just start resorting to ad hominem attacks, and that's usually how it goes. I did this morning. I saw a video that apparently is from 1966, and they were giving a little presentation on what the lunar the LEM, the construction and what it's going to do in the future, because again, this was in 1966, and where they tested out and whatnot. And it was about 30 minutes, and I picked up a couple of interesting tidbits and just more stuff that makes you scratch your head. If anything, it just makes me laugh at the whole thought that with that dinosaur era's tech, they were able to make such an outstanding feat as to get to the moon. I'm looking at these switchboards. I mean, they tried their best. I'll give them that. But it still looks goofy as all hell. They've got a million little switches here and there, and you have to wonder what these little switches were for. To me, it's just like they were trying to copy science fiction of the time, to make it look high tech, but there's nothing high tech about it. And at one point they displayed how the legs for the LEM kicks out, and the guy recording it almost got his knee taken out because he's standing too close to it. No safety precautions. I mean, there were so many little things I was able to pick up, the lack of safety protocols in place, and just the craftsmanship in general. Like, again, I believe they tried their best to make a good quality vehicle, but it still looks like crap. Um, and I know laughing at the lunar module lander is not a, I guess Dr. Raza would say that's just one of those things that makes you go, but it's not a smoking gun. I completely realize it, but it's still one of my favorite pieces to analyze and laugh at. What are your thoughts when you think of the lunar module or lunar lander?
Just before I go on to that, let me just say about flat Earth. I don't believe it, but flat earthers the only fear they have is the sphere.
Is the sphere itself.
Is the sphere itself.
See, and I'm one of the types, I don't believe in censorship at all, so I'll listen to anyone say anything, because I truly believe that if your argument is stronger than the other person's argument, you battle it in the arena of ideas. And so if someone believes in the flat earth or whatever, I go, give me your best. I've had flat earthers on my show. Give me your best evidence. And where they fall every time is, okay, show me, okay, if you don't believe in the sphere, what is your idea of what this earth is, and what is the verifiable evidence to prove that your model is correct? And you'll never get it. They'll point to some images here and there. I mean, because some of the questions they ask are legitimate questions, and to have doubts in NASA, I think, is completely legitimate because of the track record NASA has given us. I heard you on a video say NASA stands for never a straight answer, and that's exactly it.
Yeah.
And so there's nothing wrong with that, but when you are making the claim, okay, the Earth is not a sphere, it is flat, you need to have a verifiable model that anyone can check for themselves, and that's where they lack.
Exactly, they do lack it.
Yeah.
That comment, by the way, NASA being never a straight answer, do you know where that originated?
No, I do not. I heard you say it.
Yeah, I said, because it's quite funny. I mean, there are various other ones, like no astronaut sent anywhere, or numerous anomalies and scams abound, all that sort of stuff. It's great fun. I mean, anybody can do it. But the originator of the never a straight answer was the New York Times in 1968. They actually said it because they were trying to get answers from NASA about various things that they were asking questions about, and they couldn't get the answers, hence never a straight answer. That's where it originated from. So it goes back quite a long way.
Yeah, the history.
The lunar lander you asked about, it didn't need to be aerodynamic because it was never going to fly in an atmosphere. And we all know the moon doesn't have an atmosphere, so it didn't need to be aerodynamic. But as you say, it is a very strange looking object. And if you compare that lander, which is the sort of four legs splayed out, and the descent stage, which is it's in two halves, this lander. The astronaut sat in the ascent stage, the bit was going to go up, and all the fuel tanks and things to stop it crashing into the moon, hopefully, were in the bottom half, the descent stage. So it's two halves. And in total, with the fuel on board, it weighed about 15 tons, about 30,000 pounds. I mean, we're talking quite a big piece of kit. And it was in orbit around the moon with the command module, with the third astronaut, Michael Collins, who was never spoken to very much when they were on the lunar surface. That's another story. They separated from the command module, left Michael Collins in orbit around the moon, which is about 60 miles above the moon. He's traveling at about 4,000 miles an hour in order to remain in orbit. And they come down, Aldrin and Armstrong come down onto the lunar surface. So they have to slow down from the 4,000 miles an hour speed. That's faster than a bullet, by the way. 4,000 miles an hour is quite fast. But there's no atmosphere, so they're not going to be able to have a heat shield, so they don't slow down that way. So they turn the thing round and fire the rocket to slow them down. Good thinking. As long as they slow it down enough. Now, this rocket on the lunar lander in two halves, you got one rocket in the descent stage to slow them down, and you've got another rocket in the ascent stage, the top half, for them to take off and return to the orbiting command module and get back to Earth. That's the story. So it doesn't need to be aerodynamic, but it needs to work flawlessly first time. Because if you've got a rocket that doesn't start when you want to get back to your mate in the command module, you've got a real problem. So it has to be absolutely certain it will start. And the way they did that was quite a sensible solution. They used two liquid, one fuel, one oxidizer. They're both liquid, and they're pumped together. As soon as those two liquids come together, they explode. Basically, they don't need an ignition source, like your car needs a spark plug. It doesn't need that. It's like a diesel car where you get compression, which ignites it. This is just a combination of two fluids, which coming together create liquid fuel rockets. If they didn't come together, and the reason that they come together is there's a helium tank, pressurized helium tank, which when a switch is opened, it allows the helium in to the oxidizer or the fuel and forces it out. That's how it works. It's pretty straightforward, it's pretty simple, but it has to work first time. The problem is that the fuel used, hypergolic fuel, is very corrosive. So they had to rebuild this engine every time it was tested. So it couldn't be tested because they'd have to start again. So you have a liquid fueled rocket with no testing, and the lives of the astronauts and the eyes of the world are watching this. So you've got to make sure it works. So how do you make sure it works? You don't give them any opportunity to fail. Oh, but we had a problem. Buzz Aldrin broke a switch. When you mentioned all the switches they had in their lander, he was wearing his backpack, with the life support system on it, and he was moving around, and he knocked one of the switches. Fortunately, he had a pen which went into the hole, and he was able to make it work. How fortunate is that? That's the luck of Apollo. Every time we have the luck of Apollo. Now here's a question which anybody can answer. You're in your lunar lander. It's quite small. The total space available to you, to the two astronauts, is 160 cubic feet, which is not a lot. 6 foot high, 4 foot deep. That's 24, and about 5 foot wide, 5 or 6 foot wide. Anyway, they had 160 cubic feet. Okay, that's about the size of the interior of an average small car. Have you ever tried changing your trousers in your car when there's a passenger in as well? Possibly you have. It's not easy. So what I'm saying here is that the two astronauts, when they flew up on the command module, they then moved into the lunar lander. They were not in their spacesuits, not in the spacesuits they would use to go to the lunar surface, because the connecting tunnel between the command module and the lunar lander is 24 inches in diameter. That is not big enough to get through if you're wearing a spacesuit and a backpack, the PLSS, Portable Life Support System. So we've got a problem here. They're in their lunar lander, without their spacesuits on. They have to get the spacesuits on, check them out, making sure there are no leaks and everything's done up properly and the helmet's on properly and all the oxygen is working. So each one would check the other. But there's no mention of this in the transcripts. It's as if they suddenly got into their spacesuits. Oh, goody, goody. Got into their spacesuits. Now they can get out. So they've got to depressurize the lander, because you can't get out if it's pressurized, because you can't open the door, because the door is 30 inches square. And the internal pressure of the lander is about £5 per square inch. So you've got 2 tons of air pressure on your door. You can't open it. So you have to depressurize it, let all the air out, so you can open the door. But you've got to have your spacesuit on at this point, and you've got to make sure that your mate's spacesuit is fine. And it's an interesting question to ask. The spacesuits, if you examine them closely, have zippers on them. How do you pressurize a zipper? You don't. It leaks. It's all stitched together. How do you ensure that the stitches are airtight? You can't. So you've got a spacesuit which is a bit dubious. And this is before you've even got out. And anybody who cares to look at it, the photograph taken by Neil Armstrong, who was the first one out, hence first man on the moon, that's what upset Buzz Aldrin. And the reason it upset him was because he was lunar module pilot. And the lunar module pilot in all previous spacecraft was always the first one out. Whether it's the Gemini craft, obviously the Mercury craft only had 1 astronaut. The Gemini had 2 astronauts. And the pilot, the designated pilot, was always the first one to be able to get out. So when Aldrin was designated lunar module pilot, he was the guy who was going to fly it, except he didn't. Armstrong did. He thought he was going to be first out, first on the moon, big hero, known throughout history as a first man on the moon, except it didn't happen. So the legend goes, and I don't know if there's any evidence for this, he said, Neil, if you're first out on the moon, I ain't taking a picture. But there's no picture of Neil Armstrong on the lunar surface, is there? I wonder if that story had some degree of credibility. Probably more credibility than the Good Luck Mr. Gorski story. You heard the Good Luck Mr. Gorski story?
I have not.
Ah, I'll give you that
Let's
one.
hear it.
Good Luck Mr. Gorski. When Neil Armstrong was quite young, he's playing football. This is the story. I can't confirm it, obviously, because there's no Mr. Gorski. But let's keep going with the story. When Neil Armstrong was quite young, he used to play football in his backyard. And one day the ball went over into his neighbour's garden. So Neil, being that sort of guy, climbed over the fence to go and collect his football. And it was up against his neighbour's house. And as he was collecting the football, he heard that his neighbours, Mr. and Mrs. Gorski, their names were having a bit of a row. And Mr. Gorski said, no, not Mr. Gorski, Mrs. Gorski said, oral sex? You want oral sex? I'll give you oral sex when the boy next door walks on the moon. Good luck, Mr. Gorski, alleged, was said by Neil Armstrong. No, I don't think the story is true, but I think it was something that a comedian would have said.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting little addition to the problems surrounding the whole Apollo moon landing.
There's so many, like I stated. I mean, going back to that little video that I saw, that 30-minute video on the LEM, the astronaut that was kind of giving them a little tour, he was wearing a spacesuit that looked nothing like what they were going to be wearing, 4 years later, 3 years later. It looked like he had just left Bohemian Grove, was partying it up, and is now giving. Yeah, he had like little clamps and handcuffs on his suit. I mean, nothing like what they ended up using a few years later. And
yeah,
I need to find the link so people could see it, because I thought it was a gem. I was studying it. I was observing it, because this was something that was it was propaganda. That's what it was. That was released in 1966, and it's definitely a treasure. And when you don't believe it, so I'm looking at it from the lens that man didn't make it to the moon. That's the lens that I'm observing the video. I'm seeing the movements of these people, trying to read body language and whatnot. I mean, in one scene, they're trying a prototype of the lunar module lander, and they have it on wires, and they're using a test facility that looks like it probably cost a few tens of thousands of dollars to make. And yet we're told that at that period in time, it was one of the projects that they had invested the most amount of money. It was taking a percentage of the budget of the national budget. That's what we're told. And I'm looking at some of these testing facilities, especially the one where they're testing out the lunar lander. I'm like, this looks cheap as hell. And even the prototype lunar lander, it's flimsy as hell. It's being held by wires to simulate space. That's what they tell you in that little piece. And my question is, and they're telling you that the man in there can hover it around and fly it around. So why the hell does he need wires? That was the question that I asked. I mean, show us a presentation of him hovering without any of these damn wires, similar to what a helicopter would be doing, and they have it on wires. So it's interesting because there's so many little tidbits of information you can pick up. As a skeptic, especially, you're like, wait a minute, you saying this? And even when they show the coverings for some of these wires, one of the questions that was asked, well, how are you going to be transmitting this live? Oh, well, we're going to be using cables on antennas. That's how we're going to bring you the live feed. I'll have to send you the link. I don't know if you know the video that I'm talking about, but if you haven't, I'm sure you would find it interesting. Yeah.
I mean, I spend a lot of time looking at some of these older films. I don't think I've seen that one, so it'd be interesting to see it. Because it's not one thing. There's no one action that you can identify and say, that happened, therefore the moon landings didn't happen. There's no one thing you can point to. It's an accumulation of a lot of different aspects. That's the real thing. So, if people say, well, there are 400,000 people work on the Apollo program. How do you keep a secret with 400,000 people? It would leak. Of course it would leak. The 400,000 people didn't keep a secret. They had no secret to keep. They weren't told anything of this. There was because you've got, one of the purposes of the Apollo program was to spread the load, to spread it right across American states. You've got Boeing in Washington state building the rockets and the rovers. You've got Rocketdyne in California building the Saturn V engines. You've got the control center in Texas, Houston in Texas. You've got the launch site in Florida. You've got Grumman Aircraft in New York building the
lander, I believe, wasn't it?
Yes, the lander. And then you've got who are the people who built the command module? Anyway, you've got the guys making the spacesuits in Connecticut. So you've got people right across America. Now, there are companies today with probably as big a spread of that. Offices, maybe a headquarter office somewhere in, say, Atlanta, center of America, where FedEx work from and CNN transmit from. Say you've got your head office in Atlanta, and you've got satellite offices, smaller offices spread right across America. Do you think that everybody in every one of those offices, from Washington state to California to Florida to Texas to New York state to Connecticut, would know everything about everything everybody else was doing in the company? No, of course not. I've worked for a big multinational company. It's called Toyota, the world's manufacturer of the most vehicles sold every year, about 11 million sold. Volkswagen comes close, but Toyota is the top. I had no idea what was going on in different offices right across the world, let alone what was going on in head office or the assembly plants. I visited the assembly points in Nagoya. Fascinating place to visit. I had no idea what was going on there. So to say 400,000 people couldn't keep a secret, of course they couldn't. They didn't have to. And if they were being told it was all going to be faked, how were they told? Was it a memo sent to all of them? Was it an internal? Don't forget, this is before the days of email. So the idea that 400, to even suggest it as an idea, shows a complete lack of understanding of what the question infers. The question infers that you don't know what you're talking about. If you say that 400,000 people couldn't keep a secret, they didn't. Oh no, forget it. It's just so.
Yeah, you don't have to. I mean, yeah,
No.
like just like the example you gave, I think about where I work as well. It's a fairly good sized company,
Mhm.
and I'm doing my job. My coworkers are doing their job.
Yep.
And we could go into work one day and they tell us, by the way, we just sold the company. The new management team will be coming in later on today, and blah blah blah. And holy shit, what what who told me? It doesn't matter if you work for a damn company. You don't know what the high level elites of any company, and this isn't even a conspiracy. This is a fact. This happens with all these big companies. It's something that you can try with your own company where you're working right now. You don't know what tomorrow, if they're going to be trading different stocks, and maybe they're thinking of expanding or whatever. You don't know these little things. And so when you look at something like this, it's along the same lines. Yeah, and you'll hear people say, well, my grandpa worked on making the spacesuits. That's great. I'm not saying he didn't. He probably did make some goddamn spacesuits. That doesn't mean man landed on the moon. I mean, it's I don't know. It seems pretty straightforward, but again, people get emotionally charged when talking about this. One of the things that comes to mind is how when you talk about the moon landings, it's a patriotic thing, and it brings that emotional American patriotism, exceptionalism it was on display. And if we didn't land it, or if we didn't land, the Russians would have said something. Someone else would have said something. Well, and then when you give them examples of a Russian cosmonaut, top level guy, saying the NASA moon landings were fake, they move the goalposts.
Yeah.
Well, that guy's untrustworthy anyways. That's moving the goalposts. You said something, I provided an answer to that, and now you're moving it and kicking it down the road. And the other thing that they forget is we simply don't believe the claim. When someone makes a claim, the onus is on them to demonstrate it beyond any reasonable doubt. They're the ones that made the extraordinary claim that man landed on the moon. The evidence that they provided, with the pictures, the flimsy lunar landers, the whole storylines, getting everything right on the first times, I don't buy it. It sounds fantastical. I need way more solid proof and evidence. And so then they start saying, well, watch, you just wait till the Artemis program gets there. They've been trying since 2016, and the can keeps getting pushed down the road, only solidifying my stance that man didn't land on the moon in the 1960s with that technology. If we're having a hell of a hard time with today's more advanced technology, we can't do it. It keeps getting postponed every single time. Oh, you know what? Maybe 2 years from now we'll get it right. The 2 years comes along. Well, maybe 2 years from now we'll get it right. So that argument, oh wait, you're gonna shut up, you're gonna eat your words when Artemis. Why the hell haven't we made it once in the last nearly 60 years. It's truly is a joke. I did want to ask you, Mr. Marcus, on I love this, and I feel like we will have to get our StreamYard fixed and do more moon landing talk for sure, because we can do this all day. But I did want to ask you about some of the other subjects that you do cover, because like I mentioned when we finished our show a couple of weeks ago, we did get onto some of these hidden histories, stuff that I'm truly fascinated. You do cover a lot of Egyptian hidden history, and that's a topic that truly fascinates me for many reasons. I feel the Egyptians do get quite a bit of praise as far as how advanced they were as a civilization, but I feel they still get shorted. Most empires, most civilizations will have a lifespan between 150 to 300 years. Even the greatest Mongolian empire, the ones that pretty much ran the entire known world, only lasted 150 years. And so when you think of the Egyptian civilization, this is a civilization that spanned millennia, and different peoples filled in the roles. When one people's ruled, another people's came in and ruled, and it was very diverse. And one of the things that I was told when I was a kid was, the way they moved these massive 150-ton blocks was to put them on logs and carry them. And I remember we would get pencils. They would show you, they'd grab a little object and roll down some pencils, and look how this thing rolls over these pencils. And that's how they did it. And now in the line of work that I do today, I haul heavy loads. For me, 12 tons is a light load. And the heaviest load I've ever hauled in my vehicle is 36 tons. That is some heavy load, man. My truck it's a powerful vehicle, super powerful. And it struggles. I have to make sure I've got a huge amount of following distance between myself and the next vehicle, because I can't stop. As soon as I brake, it's going to take a minute. That is just massive amounts of weight. And when I hear someone, oh yeah, moving 150 tons is easy, just lay down some pieces of log and that's how you're going to move it. These people have no idea what the hell they're talking about. Because if my vehicle, as powerful as it is struggling to move 30 damn tons, you're going to tell me people with no equipment, just, using ropes and strings, move that amount of weight? It's a freaking joke. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, Mr. Allen.
Well, it's a very good question, a very sensible question. And given the fact that you know the problem with heavy weights, I think you speak from a great deal of authority on the subject. You know the problems. Did you see? I think it was about 2-3 years ago. I think there was an exhibition or an exhibit was going to be set up in, I think it was Los Angeles, and the exhibit was a rock. It weighed 350 tons. This rock.
Yeah.
And they had to spend several $1 million just to build the vehicle to carry it.
No.
It moved about 10 miles, I think it was. And it took probably 2 days to move it, because they had to take telegraph poles down. They had to move. Anyway, the thing was about 200 foot long by the time they got the trailer. So your 36 ton is a good indication of the problem of moving something 10 times heavier.
Yeah.
Now, to return to Egypt, we have, yes, people have said, oh, they just rolled them on logs. Has anybody ever tried that? Has anybody said, okay, let's get a 50-ton block of concrete, doesn't matter what it is, 50 tons, let's put it on some logs, and let's get a bunch of people and some ropes and see if they can move it. I would say no, they won't be able to move it 1 inch, let alone.
They wouldn't move it at all. This is why, with my vehicle, it's a powerful vehicle. Um, Sometimes I go into these sites where a little truck, someone's regular truck is stuck in the dirt,
Yeah.
and I'll pull you out. You hook up to my truck, and I'll
Yeah.
pull you out. And I just don't want to damage it, so you attach it, and I'll just move my truck forward. Like, you can move me. I'm like, dude, I won't even feel you. I mean, that's how powerful my vehicle is. I can a little household truck is like a toy to my vehicle. And so when I'm hauling 36 tons, the other, for people that are having a hard time understanding these weights, a large African elephant, and I'm not talking about a little elephant. I'm talking about these massive, huge monster beasts, African elephants that dwarf anything in the forest. They dwarf trees. Even these guys have a maximum weight of around 7 tons, as large as they are. So when I'm saying 36 tons of weight, I mean, that's several of these monstrous beasts
Yeah.
that I'm hauling. And when you're talking about 150 tons, so my 36 tons is minuscule to 150 tons. There is absolutely zero way you're going to get all these damn people, thousands of people, maybe, whatever amounts of people, to move them even an inch. It wouldn't even budge. You would need advanced machinery and equipment to try to even move such things, unless maybe you're dealing with free energy. There's I don't know if you're familiar. There's a gentleman that lived in the 1950s. He built Coral Castle out here in Florida. I live in Florida, and one of my goals is to pay to visit it and see it, see it in person. But Coral Castle is something that he built himself with his bare hands without heavy equipment. And when he was asked constantly about how he built these structures, for example, he has one structure that it has a 5-ton door, 5 tons, heavy, and it spins. It just freestanding spins. He got it to spin. And when people were asking him, how do you do this? He would just laugh and basically tell him he was taking that secret with him to the grave. My feeling is that he did discover the what is known as free energy, something that people laugh about, people mock if you're looking into it, but I think there's something to it. So I'm wondering if the Egyptians and even the Mayans, had some advanced knowledge into, this free energy that we just don't understand with our current tech. What are your thoughts on that, Mr. Allen?
That's exactly the point I was going to make. You described very well the problem of moving heavy objects on sand put on rollers. For a start, in Egypt, there aren't that many trees that wouldn't crush under a weight that heavy. And there are lots of palm trees, but palm trees are not very strong. Oak trees would be good. Cedar trees would be good. They don't grow in Egypt. But that's not even the worst problem they've got. If we're talking about Egypt, now most people can picture the Great Pyramid. It's a very familiar shape. Inside the Great Pyramid is what's called the King's Chamber. There's also the Queen's Chamber and the Underground Chamber and the Grand Gallery and various tunnels. The King's Chamber is the floor of it is about 150 feet above ground level. Above the King's Chamber, 30 foot high, are 5 layers of granite blocks. If you've ever been in the King's Chamber, which I have, you can look up and you can see them. They're there. We know there are 5 layers of them. There's about 70 blocks in total, and they weigh about 60 tons each. That's the ceiling of the King's Chamber. How on earth did you get a 60-ton block of granite 200 feet into the air. Today, we might be able to do it with a very, very large and powerful crane.
Yeah.
But you've got to...
Maybe, even then, maybe, well, people have a lot of money, but yeah, it would take a massive, massive machine to try to even do that.
Yeah, I mean, there are cranes that can lift 50 tons, but can they lift them 200 feet into the air?
Yeah.
And move it 200 feet from the base of the crane? But it's not as if you just got to lift it up and put it down again. You got to move it across. So how did they do it? Now, about 15 years ago, there was a series of programs called Nova on television in America. They were sort of science-based programs. And one of the programs, they were going to build their own little pyramid. It was about 12 foot high, but it had 1-ton blocks made of sandstone, because they did it quite near the Great Pyramid, and there's no granite near the Great Pyramid, but there is a lot of sandstone. So they got these 1-ton blocks. 1 ton is actually much smaller than anything in the Great Pyramid itself. They're about 2.5 to 3 tons each, the blocks that make up the outside. And they were building this little pyramid for television. It was all being filmed. And they were going to show how they built the pyramid. And they got about halfway up, about 6-8 foot off the ground, and they started running into problems. They couldn't get the blocks up the pyramid. They were trying to pull them up. They even built ramps up to try and hold them up that way. I mean, you try building a ramp 400 feet in the air and see how far you get. It's bigger than a pyramid. And eventually, they did what any television program does, that is a bit short on time and he can't complete his objective. They got a forklift truck along and put the blocks up that way. Forklift trucks didn't exist in Egypt, so they cheated. And if they tried to demonstrate that that was how they did it, sorry, it doesn't work. There's also something else which people quite often mention. How do you break granite? And they point to they're quite obvious. You can see them in Aswan, where the granite was quarried from. There are little rows of quite small indentations, as if you've got a chisel and you've banged into it and you made a little hole. They say, no, what they did was they made these holes, and they put wooden blocks in, wetted the wooden blocks, and the wood would expand and it would split the rock. Now that's been tried. Somebody has actually done that. And what happens when you put your wooden wedge into the hole? It pops out again. It doesn't expand and break the block. So another failed experiment. But the idea that you can, what have I got? I say nobody's ever done this. They said it's a logical thing to explain. You pull it along on rollers. Yes, it's logical, but it doesn't work. It never has worked. The free energy side of it, which is a subject which people tend to shy away from because, it would, it's not part of the science laws, the laws of physics that we apply. You cannot have energy. Energy can only be created or destroyed, but it has a limit. So there's no such thing as free energy, is what they normally say. What they don't do is explain what they mean by free energy, because there is a great deal of work now being done, fortunately, into levitation by sound. There's a story that was told years ago. It was told by David Childress in one of his books, The Energy Grid, whereby and some of it is true and some of it may be extrapolated, but in the late 1930s, a Swedish doctor was invited to go to Tibet to treat some of the lamas, some of the priests there who were not particularly well. And he was invited to go there. He was a friend of several people who knew these Tibetan priests. So he agreed to go. This is the late 1930s. And he treated them and they got better and they were very grateful. And they said, well, to thank you, we'd like to demonstrate to you a method of levitation. And so what they did was to get a large block of stone. There's plenty of stone in the Himalayas in Tibet, which is where they were doing it, near Lhasa, the capital of Tibet. And it's about a 5-ton block. And they then assembled groups of drummers, trumpeters, and human voices. And at the direction of one of the senior priests there, they started chanting. And the drums started to beat rhythmically. The trumpet started being blown. Those three things, the human voice, the drums, and the trumpet, produce different frequencies of sound. If you've ever heard a trumpet, you know it's very different from a drum. If you've ever heard a drum, you know it's very different from a human voice. You combine the three together in a certain angle, and you start particular levels of chanting. What Dr. Jarl watched and filmed was the rock, 5-ton rock, lifting up about 200 feet into the air and being deposited on, it was being directed and deposited on a ledge on the mountain that they were nearby. The point of that is that the film has disappeared. It was confiscated. It was just before World War II, so there was a lot of secrecy and people getting a bit scared of what was going on. So his film was confiscated and it's never resurfaced. So whether the film even exists, nobody knows. But he said he filmed it. I have no reason to disbelieve him. He described what he said. I have no reason to disbelieve him. Because other people can demonstrate that sound has a force. You've probably seen the film of an opera singer breaking a glass with a particular note. That's the human voice doing that, vibrating the atmosphere, vibrating the air to the point where the frequency of that note destroys a glass. Oh, it's quite easy to destroy a glass, but the point is that the human voice can do it at a certain pitch. And as Nikola Tesla said, if you understand frequency, vibration, and resonance, you know the secrets of the universe. Now, Nikola Tesla is now acknowledged as being the foremost scientist of the early 20th century. They even named a car after him because Elon Musk was so enamored of Nikola Tesla's legacy. It's an interesting little point here. Nikola Tesla, as we know, died in a hotel room in New York City. And following his death, he had a lot of papers in his room, a lot of boxes of papers, a lot of things. And there were a lot of rumors about Nikola Tesla, his destruction machine and the Wardenclyffe Tower, which he had erected, and the support he had from a lot of very prominent people. He left a lot of papers in his room, about 60 boxes. The FBI, God bless them, decided that they would invite an important scientist who might be able to understand what was in some of these papers and whether they would be of benefit to the US government. Fair enough, understandable. Who was the scientist selected by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to examine Nikola Tesla's paper? Do you know?
Wasn't it Trump's uncle?
Correct. John Trump. John C. Trump. He was the man. There is a memorial in Trump Tower to his uncle, John Trump, also to Nikola Tesla.
It's funny how these coincidences of all these high-profile individuals being connected in one way, shape, form, or another.
Isn't it?
Yeah. The whole thing about sound is interesting because when you're just listening, what are you talking about? Sound moving this and that. One of my favorite things to look at is there's a temple in Chichen Itza by the Mayans, where if you get in front of that temple and you clap, the echo, that bounces off the stone walls comes back at you and makes the exact same sound that the quetzal bird makes. Every bird has its own distinct call and unique signature call. The quetzal bird, it's something like "pa-pow, pa-pow," and every time you clap, that's exactly the sound that your clapping sound converts into. And when you really, really start thinking about it, from an engineering aspect, like how does anyone go about, today we are going to make a temple, and when you clap, the sound is going to mimic this bird which we revere in our culture, and the walls need to be about this far apart, and they need to be about this. Like, how does one even begin to sort this out? And modern day sound engineers don't even know how they did this, which is a testament to their advanced understanding of many things, not just as astronomy, but engineering and so on and so forth. And to me, even though that you're not moving anything, that's another, I would say, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm off base, but to me, it has something to do with the power of sound, because although you're not moving anything, I mean, you're clapping converted over into a certain animal that is revered in your culture and your way of belief. It's fascinating. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
There's so much that's been hidden,
Yeah.
occulted. That's the technical term. That's what occult means. It means hidden. If you go back to the 1950s, the mid to late 1950s, there was a lot of work being done by a lot of scientists around the world, specifically in America, on electrogravitics, the connection between electricity and gravity, free energy. When we talk about 0 point, what is the 0 point that we refer to? 0 point energy. The 0 point is the point at which all movement ceases. It's at absolute zero. Absolute zero has a temperature. It's minus 273 degrees centigrade or Celsius. That's the technical use of it. Celsius and centigrade are the same thing, same measurement of temperature. Minus 273 is the point at which all molecular activity stops, hence 0 point. There was a book written about 25 years ago called The Hunt for 0 point. It was written by an English journalist who used to work for Jane's Weekly, which is a defense magazine published about battleships and aircraft and guns and such like. But he decided to examine some of the artifacts that remained in Nazi Germany that had been taken over by various Allied forces, the British, the French, the Russians and the Americans. And they couldn't understand what these things were. And then they started reading some of the paperwork that the scientists involved had been doing, and they were working on 0 point energy. We tend to call it, we misname it by saying it's free energy. Well, technically it's free because it doesn't cost anything, any more than the wind costs anything, but the equipment required to generate the energy from the wind does cost a lot of money. So 0 point energy is the point at which all molecular activity ceases. Now, if the atmosphere, if space, which is full of nothing, there's nothing in space, except for electricity, as we understand electricity, if you can tap into that electricity, that is the 0, because the space is basically, it has no temperature, but the electricity does not have mass, so it doesn't have a temperature. But there is energy within space, 0 point energy. That's why it's called 0 point energy. If we can tap into that energy, you've got access to unlimited power, unlimited energy. And it's now pointing to the fact that the research that has been going on and has been done by people around the world, that 0 point energy is real. If you can tap in to the 0 point, i.e. space, the electricity of space, the energy of space. There's plenty of energy in space. If we can access it, and that was what was being done in the 50s, the electrogravitics, the electricity and the gravity. There is gravity in space, and there's electricity in space, there's magnetism in space, and there's atomic energy in space. So you've got all these things. If we as humans trying to examine how we can access this energy, we just have to look at what our ancient ancestors did. The Egyptians were using energy in some form. It's now being looked at that the pyramid was not a tomb. That's a dead theory. I can explain where it came from, where the idea of the pyramid as a tomb came from. It was to do with the religious societies that were examining it. They named it a tomb. It's not a tomb. It's an energy generating device.
Yeah, I've heard that some people posit that it was almost like a nuclear power plant, like an ancient form of that. Could you expand on that? Like, and I'm there with you, but for those that have only just grown up hearing that it was a tomb, to help them understand, look, it wasn't a tomb.
Forget it being a tomb. No, forget it. Nobody has ever been found in it. The implication it was a tomb is based on the fact that inside the king's chamber, the big king's chamber, it's a big room, there's a box in there, and it was called a sarcophagus. A sarcophagus is what you put a body in if you're going to bury it, if they're sort of monarchs or head priests, important people. But there was no body ever found in that box. There's no body ever been found in any pyramid. There's no writing inside any pyramid describing it. Where pharaohs were buried was in the Valley of the Kings, several miles north of Luxor. Those tombs are brilliantly decorated. They got huge panels of wonderful illustration. But there's no evidence that there was any form of light. Oh, they said, no, we used mirrors and we directed the sunlight down. Oh, forget that. You won't be able to do that. Because there's no soot on the ceiling, because they only had torches made of oily cloths or something like that. But these tombs are decorated, and you have to be able to see quite closely what you're looking at. So obviously the Egyptians would have had some form of lighting, non-soot producing lighting, i.e. what we call electric light, artificial light. That's what we call it. We take it for granted. You've got light on your face. I've got light on my face. It's an artificial light. We take it for granted. The Egyptians probably took it for granted as well, because that's what they understood. They also, because don't forget the Egyptians, they're called Egyptians. That's not the original name for the people who lived in Egypt. The original, came from the Greek name, because the Greeks took over Alexander the Great took over Egypt about 300 BC. And their name was Egyptos, Aegyptos, Egyptos, anglicized to Egypt. But the original inhabitants of the land we call Egypt were called Kemetians, Kemet. They weren't Egyptians. The current inhabitants of the land we refer to as Egypt are the people who are now the custodians of these remarkable monuments, machines. Now, the person who's probably done most to look into this area is a lovely man called Christopher Dunn. He lives in, he's actually British. He was born in England. He moved to America in 1969, and he's lived there ever since. And he lives in Illinois. He works for Danville Metal Stamping. Well, he's retired now, and his son works for Rolls-Royce in the same business. High-tech engineering. Aircraft and jet engines, where you need extremely fine tolerances, extremely fine manufacturing and measurement. And Christopher Dunn had been interested in Egypt and the mystery of the pyramids for many years. He visited Egypt about 50 years ago. And he wrote an article suggesting that the Great Pyramid could have been a machine. Now, being a machinist himself and fully conversant with modern technology in terms of machining, he decided to examine this as a machine, not as a tomb. And he tried to back engineer the Great Pyramid, which he succeeded in doing. He explains it in great detail in his first book called The Giza Power Plant. That was published in 1998. So he'd spent many years examining what was going on, testing it, doing experiments to prove that the Great Pyramid was a machine to produce energy. He's now updated his work because he was, one of the things he suggested many years ago, because he'd been to Egypt many times, he said, what would be really good is if current Egyptian scientists started examining their legacy. And now many Egyptian scientists have done exactly that. They've started looking at the Great Pyramid and other pyramids and looking at it from the point of view of it being a machine to generate energy. It's still at the early stages yet, but the evidence would appear to indicate that the Great Pyramid is a machine to generate energy. And the internal structure of it, which is extremely strange when you think about it as a tomb, forget being a tomb, that's a dead theory now. But as an energy generating machine, all the parts are there, including those famous air shafts we're referred to, which enter both the King's Chamber. They're 8 inches square, these shafts, far too small for any human to get up them. But when a robot was built by a German scientist called Gantenbrink, he sent this little robot crawling up this air shaft and see where it went, because nobody could find where it exited outside the pyramid. Nobody could find it. They could find the ones where these alleged air shafts, which are now used as air shafts to ventilate the King's Chamber and the Queen's Chamber. But the original access point of the air shaft into the King's Chamber wasn't immediately obvious. Somebody went along tapping the wall, and one point they tapped it, it sounded hollow. They thought maybe there's something behind it. This is before they even knew about the air shafts. They tapped along the wall. What's that? It's something different. So they hammered through the granite, which is quite difficult, and they found this little air shaft. They said, where does it go? And nobody could find it because there's no point on the outside of the pyramid where the shaft from the King's Chamber exits. So they didn't really know what it was until Gantenbrink got his little robot, sent it right the way. It's quite a long shaft, this, right to the end, and he found there's a doorway at the end. That's how far he could get. And he photographed it on his robot, and it showed 2, what turned out to be copper, what could be described as electrodes, poking through the door. Years later, another robot was sent up that drilled through the door to find out what was the other side of it, which they did. And there's another door just beyond it. So there's no exit that anybody has found. But if it's a tomb, why do you need an air shaft? Dead bodies don't need air. But a machine needs certain activity taking place. It's a technical. Well, it's not a technical book. It's an adventure story. But the details of it have now been expanded by Chris Dunn in his latest book, Giza. I get this, Giza, the Tesla Connection. That's his latest book, where he's being advised by very, very senior engineers, not just in Egypt, but around the world, people who work for aircraft companies, engine manufacturing companies, people like Rolls-Royce, who make jet engines for long-haul aircraft. They know what they're doing, Rolls-Royce. They started making cars. The Rolls-Royce car company and the Rolls-Royce aircraft company are now completely separate companies. They retain the name, but that's all. Charles Rolls was one of the originators, hence Rolls-Royce. And they've now produced their SUV, sports utility vehicle. Rolls-Royce is a luxury passenger car. Their SUV is the Rolls-Royce Cullinan, named after the biggest diamond ever found, the Cullinan diamond. And it's a huge vehicle, absolutely wonderful vehicle. Check it out online. I mean, it costs about £300,000, about $500,000, but
I'll take two, please.
Yeah, well, that's $500,000. So, I mean, there are plenty of rap stars who've got it now. Drake, I think, has got one. 50 Cent has got one. But it's a beautiful vehicle. Anyway, so people who work in that area, building not just vehicles like that, but jet engines on which our lives depend if we're up in the air. You know, a little aluminium tube that's 5 miles up. You've got to have the engines that work. And that's what these guys do. So these guys are as interested in jet engines as they are in the Great Pyramid and how that was built. So there are people who have the background in engineering, the background in technology, examining the Great Pyramid. So forget tombs. It's nowhere near a tomb. It's an energy device. It's still being worked on. But the work that Tesla did and the experiments that he conducted indicate that if energy can be transmitted wirelessly, i.e. through the earth or through the atmosphere, we've got access to as much energy as we could possibly want. So why do we need windmills and bloody solar panels? That's so 20th century. It's just ridiculous. Let's not get into that.
Yeah, it's that, you know, everything that you're talking about, that's what perplexes me. I remember when I worked at a transportation company in Salt Lake City, Utah. We had to go through orientation, and in one of the conference rooms, they had a picture of Salt Lake City, Utah in 1911, and they had electric trains in 1911. And I wasn't into the conspiratorial mindset back then. I remember looking at that. I'm like, whoa. Imagine if they kept working at that. We'd have flying vehicles, you know, throughout town now. And I never understood it. Now that I go down these rabbit holes, it seems to make more sense. You know, the petrol monopolies weren't going to allow, you know, any competition. You know, I'm sure that played a role in it. You know, in much the same way that Garrison Randolph William Hearst, I think that's his name, the newspaper magnate, the father of yellow journalism, stamped out hemp or cannabis.
Yeah, he did.
Saying that, and he used propaganda to stamp the business out. And you fast forward to today, you know, nearly 100 years later, after Mr. Randolph Hearst threw out his propaganda, a lot of people are like, oh, cannabis is the devil's lettuce, you know, it's evil and blah, blah, blah. And then you ask these people, why do you think it's so evil? Well, my parents taught me it was evil. Okay, why did they think it was evil? They really don't know, but it was all through propaganda to eliminate a competitor. And now people are finally realizing, well, the fibers for hemp are super strong. You can make tons and tons of material. It's not just about smoking it. There's medicinal use for it. There's so much to it. But it had been demonized for all this time because of the propaganda. So I wonder if something similar along those lines happened with the petrol industry wanting to stamp out any electric vehicles. Now they're doling out these electrical vehicles that self-drive, and they're acting like it's a brand new innovation when you can see that they were working on this well in excess of over 100 years ago. What are your thoughts when it comes to that?
Well, exactly that. I mean, the first successful vehicles were electric vehicles in America. I mean, if you check any history of the motor car, you'll find that the speed records were held by electric cars at the beginning of the 20th century. They weren't held by petrol cars, but because electric cars, as modern cars are finding now, have a limited range, and this new internal combustion engine came along, which would give you virtually unlimited range if you filled it up from the various filling stations that you'd pass along the way, because it's much easier to store petrol than it is to store electricity. You can generate electricity, but storing it is a completely different ballgame. So you can't store it. But the first cars were electric. Oh, here's a question. Why do people in the UK drive on the left-hand side of the road?
That's a good question.
Okay.
I want to know because
Right.
I watch Mr. Bean and I'm like, what? Why is he driving on the wrong side of the road?
Oh, he's driving. No, that's a good point. He's driving on the correct side of the road. Okay. Most people are right-handed. They hold things in their right hand. It's just the way humans work. There are a few people who use their left hand, but the majority of people use their right hand. So if you're living in a country like the UK, before the days of police, you had to defend yourself. So if you're going to walk from one village to another, you don't know what might happen on the way. You might get attacked by a bear or not a lion. We didn't have lions in the UK, but bears or animals that might do you harm. And also maybe highwaymen, people who were going to rob you. So you would defend yourself. You would use a sword or you'd use a gun and you'd hold it in your right hand. And you would walk with your left side to the hedge. In the UK, we have quite small roads. It's a small country. It's smaller than Oregon. The whole UK is smaller than Oregon. So it's small, but a lot of people live here. We're very nice people. So you walk with your left-hand side close to the hedge or the ditch. So if you were going to be attacked, and the attacker would come from your right-hand side because he would have his sword in his right hand, so he would attack you and you would defend yourself. Now, if you're going to ride a horse, you do the same thing on a horse because you get attacked as well. So you would ride on the left-hand side of the road, defend yourself with your right hand. So when motor cars come along, there are a lot of horses and carriages. So they had to fit in with those horses and carriages so they could look out to see if it was safe to overtake. And so they would have the steering wheel on the right-hand side of the car and drive on the left-hand side of the road, just as they'd always done on horses. And if you look at all the countries that still drive on the left-hand side of the road, most of them were British controlled at some point. Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada changed, but Canada was a British colony. Hong Kong. Japan is also one of the major countries that were never part of the British Empire, which drive on the left-hand side of the road for the simple reason that the Japanese motor manufacturers in the 1920s and 1930s were importing vehicles from America and from Britain. So they had to use what was being imported. And if it came from Britain, it was driving on the left, so that's how they drove on the left in Japan. Most other countries followed the lead set by France, we've had 1,000 years of arguing with the French. We're only 20 miles apart over the English Channel, but the French always do things differently to the English. So if the English are going to drive on the left, we're going to drive on the right in France. And that's what they did. Napoleon tried to invade Britain. He didn't get very far, so he tried to invade Russia. And hence we have the 1812 Overture, which is a wonderful piece of music. But he made a big mistake. He got defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, hence the ABBA song, Waterloo. And then he got captured at Waterloo. He made a fatal mistake. And he got shipped off by the British to St. Helena and imprisoned, where he died. He was brought back to Paris and buried in Paris. But the British drive on the left, which is the correct side of the road to drive on. And I know in America you say it's the wrong side, and we have roundabouts and you don't. But that is the reason why we drive on the left, which has a logical and historical and correct history behind it. So next time somebody says we drive on the wrong side of the road, you'll know to correct them, and you'll know why we drive on the left.
Well, I have driven on the wrong side, I mean right side of the road. When I used to do residential garbage, the recycle trucks had right side driving, so that we could just step out and pick up the bins and get back in and roll. Because if we were doing left side, we'd have to traverse the whole vehicle up and around. So right side driving is what worked. And I must say, when I first started driving a right side vehicle, it was a mind illusion. It was the weirdest thing. But once you get used to it, it's really not that bad. It's just like any other thing. It's just a matter of getting accustomed to it. I did want to ask you regarding what are your thoughts on extraterrestrial life? Do you think it's a psyop? Do you think that there is a chance? Or do you think they have visited us? Just a few days ago, there was a article in which Harvard said that there's possibly an alien base on the moon, and that these aliens look like humans and are living amongst us. This was a Harvard study, and if most of the people reacting to that article were simply mocking the article because Harvard is no longer credible because of the amount of scumbags that have come out of Harvard lately. And so that's kind of it's kind of taken a toll on their reputation, if you will. But for me personally, I don't know what to believe when it comes to intelligent life. I'm not averse to the possibility of it being out there. I do wonder if they've come and made contact, or maybe they're just so far away from us and evolved completely different to, when we see, when Hollywood pitches these extraterrestrial beings, they're very humanoid-like. And some will make the argument, well, that's probably what happens when mankind gets super intelligent. They're no longer violent. They're more enlightened, so their brains are bigger, and they've got soft little bodies because, they no longer need to work, like what we do. That's a theory. But I wonder if maybe there is something that is outside the realm of anything that we've thought about, something just completely new, completely different. I don't know what to believe. I used to want to think that there was intelligent life out there, but now the more the government is propping it up and talking about it, now I'm more skeptical, because now I feel like it's propaganda for them to wanting us to believe. What are your thoughts on that, Mr. Allen?
Oh, interesting point. Is E.T. real? It's basically the question, isn't it? Is E.T. extraterrestrial? Not the Steven Spielberg.
Not the movie, yeah.
Not the movie, no. Though it was always said that the guy who ran the Lockheed Skunk Works Ben Rich, I think it was, who was asked about ET. He said, "We have the technology to get ET home." I thought that's a very interesting point to make. Very interesting. Either he was being sarcastic or he was being honest. And Ben Rich was always known for being very honest. And he ran the skunk works where things were made which seemed a bit unreal. The idea that Harvard might put forward the suggestion that ET lives inside the moon is actually not a new idea. It was first publicized in 1970 by two Russian scientists who suggested that the moon was hollow. And remember the famous phrase when NASA crashed one of its rockets into the moon, it rang like a bell. I don't know how they knew that, but because they've never shown us the evidence for that. But if they said it rang like a bell, that implies it's hollow. And the two Russian scientists, whose names I can't recall precisely, but the book they wrote was called "Someone Else is on Our Moon." There's that one. This is about 50 or 55 years ago it was published. Now, if that is correct, and the moon is artificial, you've got to get your head around this. It's 2,000 miles in diameter. It's a big thing, the moon. If the moon is artificial, could it have been deliberately placed in its present orbit, which is extremely accurate, as exactly circular around Earth? And also the moon, when viewed from Earth, is exactly the diameter to eclipse the sun. Could it be that when mankind is intelligent enough to ask that question, why is the moon precisely the same diameter as the sun when viewed from the Earth? We know the sun is much further away, 400 times further away than the moon is. And the moon is 400 times smaller than the sun, but it eclipses it. It's a very dramatic event. If you've ever seen a total eclipse of the sun, it's a very dramatic thing to see. You can't miss it, but it gets cold as well. There's no heat. Anyway, if the moon is hollow and deliberately placed in orbit to enable the conditions to exist on Earth, for life to develop, could that be why they're there? They're just keeping an eye on us. It's the famous Star Trek first directive: do not interfere. If ET is for real, and I happen to believe he is, or she, or they, or it, or whatever you want to call it, got to get the correct pronoun for ET now, otherwise we're going to get into trouble.
Come get it. Come get it.
Come and get it. I'm sure ET has something to say. So you've got this idea that ET has something to do with the creation of life on Earth. And being a responsible sort of ET person, they hang around to make sure everything's going to go okay. And they'll maybe not interfere, but they'll try to direct us in the right path of development. And the obvious place for them to live, if they're going to do that, is inside the moon, because the moon keeps one face towards Earth at all times. So one face is not visible from Earth. It's not called the dark side of the moon. That's the great record by Pink Floyd. It's called the far side of the moon because we don't see it, but it gets as much light as the front side does. And we can't see anybody going in and out, can we? If ET lives there. And the indication is that something is happening on the moon, or has happened. Back in the mid-1960s, NASA wanted to find out where the best place was to land their craft. So they sent an orbiter called Lunar Orbiter, the reasonable name, not to be confused with the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which came in 2009. The Lunar Orbiter of 1966 photographed certain areas of the moon with very high quality cameras, so they get detail of the Earth. The thing is, it has to orbit the moon. It's about 50 miles up, so it's got to have a good camera. And they took a lot of photographs, and one photograph which I've seen, I've got a copy of, is a photograph of the Vitello crater. Now, the Vitello crater is 15 miles or so in diameter. It's got a central peak, as many craters on the moon do have. And the lunar orbiter took this photograph of the central peak in the Vitello craters. It's in the southwest corner, southwest quadrant of the moon. You can see it. You just put Vitello crater, it'll tell you where it is, and you can see it. When the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter was sent up, it photographed the same area. Now, the photograph from the Lunar Orbiter, 1966, shows something moving across the lunar surface and ending in what looks like a large rock. So you've got this track. It's not, if you roll a ball across sand, it'll leave a track, but it's not as wide as the diameter of the ball you roll across the sand. The track on the moon in the Vitello crater is as wide as the object that made it. I have to assume that the object at the end of the track was what created the track. But that track comes up out of a crater across the lunar surface, avoiding various rocks in the way. It's almost as if it's a car or a vehicle or something intelligently controlled, but it's not the only one. Looking in more detail at the same photograph, you can see 3 other tracks, all of which end with an object at the end of it. Now, NASA were asked about this. How do you explain this? They were saying. This is before anything to do with Apollo. Oh, they said, that's easy. That's rocks dislodged by moonquakes. Sounds sensible, sounds logical. But rocks dislodged by moonquakes rolling up out of a crater doesn't make sense. And the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter took the same photograph. And I got that photograph as well. And it shows exactly the same track. So it hasn't moved in 50 odd years. But something has moved on the lunar surface before man allegedly arrived there. Man never arrived there, but that's another story. Things happen on the moon that we don't fully understand. There are people who say they've seen photographs taken of the moon which show intelligent constructions by bases on the far side of the moon. But those photographs have never been publicly released because NASA, God bless them, airbrush out all the things you're not supposed to look at. But NASA shouldn't do that. NASA was set up as a civilian agency in 1958 by President Eisenhower to stop the protests from the Soviet Union, as it was at the time, the Russians, the protests from the Russians because America was overflying Soviet territory in their U-2 spy plane, one of which got shot down. Gary Powers got prosecuted. He was the pilot. So President Eisenhower decided that they would stop flying planes across the Soviet Union and they would set up a civilian organization to investigate space, hence NASA, set up in 1958. But NASA is part of the Department of Defense. And a lot of the launches of the space shuttle were for the Department of Defense. That is why the space shuttle is the shape and size it is. It's quite a big piece of kit. It's about 50 foot long. It was to launch and orbit spy satellites. And one of those spy satellites was called the KH-9, the hexagon. It fitted inside the space shuttle. So when it was launched, nobody could see what was inside it. The hexagon was a spy satellite, deliberately overflying Russia, photographing what was required, and returning its film, get this, its film back to Earth in buckets that were released from the spy satellite and caught, get this, by aircraft flying catching nets to get the parachute that was allowing the buckets to descend. It's amazing, absolutely extraordinary. And I mean, I'm not making this up. You can go and see Hexagon Spy Satellite Bucket Catch and there are planes that flew out of Hawaii to catch him. And that's how they got the film back. But get this, the film in the satellite, in the Hexagon spy satellite, was contained within a pressurized environment because the vacuum would have destroyed the film, as NASA tells us. So film doesn't work in space, as NASA knew, as the Department of Defense knew. So where are all these photographs of Apollo? They were taken here on Earth under controlled conditions.
Do you think it's possible that you know, maybe the governments, or the American government especially, has figured out some of this free energy, or some of this advanced technology, and people say that whatever we see rolled out, they're already ahead 20, 30 years, ahead of anything that we have. And we're seeing advances with artificial intelligence. We're seeing so many technological advances, and I sometimes wonder if this is what people are seeing in the skies, as UAPs, advanced craft, man-made craft, have you. What are your thoughts on that? Or maybe it's stuff that has been engineered from other intelligent crafts, such as the Bob Lazar story. What are your thoughts when it comes to that?
Yeah, people like Bob Lazar I consider to be perfectly legitimate, honest observers. And the story he tells sounds fantastic when you think about it. But the area that he describes, the Area 51 location that he describes, called S4, which is a bit further west from the Groom Lake facility, which has been photographed by the Russians. That was how it was first discovered. Not discovered, that was how it first became publicized. Russian satellite photographed Groom Lake with all the runway and the buildings and published it. They said, "Oh, look what we found." So the American government had to come up and say, "Yeah, well, it's for real. We've been working there about 40 years at the time." That's where the U-2 came from, the SR-71. Do you know why it's called the SR-71? That wasn't its name. It was originally called the Reconnaissance Satellite. No, not satellite. Reconnaissance Observer. When Lyndon Johnson announced it publicly in 1964, he misread it. Instead of RS-71, he said it as SR-71. But it's still a beautiful plane, the Blackbird. Still the fastest.
Wasn't it top, 2,000 miles an hour?
Yep, 2,000
something along those lines.
Yeah.
But the part of the reason that it stopped, they stopped using it was the amount of fuel to power that thing, is just, it was a gas guzzler, if you will. And I guess that kind of touches back to the whole trying to get rockets with today's technology back to the moon. We're being told that to get one of our rockets to the moon, it would take damn near 20 of these massive rockets. Yeah, it just gets funnier. It kind of coming back around to what I said earlier, where we get told these things, and if you don't look into them, it just sounds perfectly reasonable. And it's when you start dissecting it, the whole thing is a joke. And even the way they presented it, that what's his name, Destin from Smarter Every Day, he's the gentleman that gave the presentation, saying that we're gonna have to push the Artemis program back. We thought it was going to take 3 rockets to get one of ours up into space. Now it turns out it's 8, but apparently now it's 12 and 15, and the number just keeps increasing, and the Artemis date keeps getting pushed back further and further, showing you that even with all the advances we have today, we still can't get to the damn moon. But we're supposed to believe that we made it in 1969. And if we don't, you are a crackpot conspiracy theorist.
Let's just pause a minute. Do you know where that phrase conspiracy theorist came from? Who originated the idea of conspiracy theories?
I don't know who exactly, but it sounds like it came around, the Mockingbird media era, to discredit anyone that questioned the Kennedy assassination. A lot of people had questions. It didn't look like one lone gunman, and so in order to shut conversation down, you just call people a conspiracy theorist, to discredit them. And shut them up. It's not very different than in modern times calling people anti-vaxxers, or anti-whatever. You just put in anti, add your pronoun of your choice, and now you discredit that person. That person is a bigot. That person has hate speech. That person is a conspiracy theorist. On and on and on. It's just a way to shut down any legitimate questions or inquiry.
Yeah, but it's interesting, isn't it, how often conspiracy theories seem to become true after a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, as you say, the term conspiracy theory existed quite a long before Kennedy assassination, but that it was popularized, for want of a better word, by American government organizations. Let's call them the clans in action, for want of a better word, in order to deflect from the official story. The official story was lone nut gunman, 6th floor building, very good shot, oh dear. Now, a lot of people, Mark Lane being one of the more prominent ones at the time, were investigating this. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense that one person can do that sort of damage. And there was all sorts of things came out. I mean, we're still looking into it now. And even now, 60 years after it happened, the full release of information still hasn't taken place. It was mandated to take place in 2018 by President Trump. The documents were supposed to be released after 50 years. That would have been 2013. But there's still thousands of pages that are still not being released. What is the problem, everybody?
National security is what we're told every single time, even though many of these people are long, gone.
Yeah,
but it's still national security. Yeah, I had a Mr. Chuck Ocelli on, I believe, last week. He's been going real deep into the JFK assassination. I'm good friends with Corey Hughes too, who is another JFK researcher. But Chuck Ocelli had a gentleman that is suing the government. He works with the JFK archives, or, something along those lines, and they're suing to try to get the last documents out because Obama was supposedly release some, and that never happened. Then Trump came around; he was supposed to release them, didn't happen. Then Biden claimed he was going to release some, then more redactions are needed. And again, what in national security? The only national security is if people found out the truth that the government assassinated the president. People would be irate, and who knows, maybe push them over the edge to maybe a revolution, and maybe that's what they're classifying as national security. They're trying to cover their own behinds. That's the national security, is in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think we're certainly on the right track on that one. And I think there's a terrible fear of internal revolution in America. But they keep bigging it up, as we say in the UK. They keep bigging it up. Oh, there's going to be internal revolution and there's all this sort of split between political aspects in America. Maybe some of them are correct. Maybe some of them are a bit exaggerated. But as I've always described Apollo, as a brilliantly executed propaganda exercise, because you have to put Apollo into context of its time. Late 1960s, early 1970s. What else was going on in and around America at that time? There was the
JFK, Vietnam, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Fred Hampton, RFK Sr. So, the RFK Sr. assassination is probably the most blatant of all these other ones. The other ones had government involvement, no question, but the RFK Sr. one is even more obvious because the official narrative said that Sirhan, the little Palestinian immigrant, that little fella shot RFK from the front from about 10 to 15 feet across the room. Well, the Kennedy family, because John F. Kennedy had suffered a mysterious assassination, they weren't going to allow the government to do their autopsy. They were going to do their own autopsy. And their own autopsy determined that the death shots came from behind at skin contact range, completely at odds with the official narrative. So that's one of those that is a slam dunk as far as the conspiracy world. There's no question, there's no and ifs or buts about it. And so you have those things going on, and like you mentioned, Vietnam, so much turmoil. And what better way to heal this nation than to fake a moon landing?
Exactly. Because, just to return to Vietnam, just for a little bit, because that started basically in 1964, because Kennedy, who was president up till November 1963, was determined to remove American troops from Vietnam. He didn't want any war. He was not interested. When he was assassinated, the number of American troops sent to Vietnam increased by, I think it was 500,000 in total were sent. Most of them didn't want to go. They said, we have, like the famous Muhammad Ali. He said, I have no beef with the Vietnamese. They've done me no harm. I don't intend to do them harm. I'm not going to go. He was very brave to do that, given what was going on. The thing that started the Vietnam War, we're told, is what's called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where North Vietnamese torpedo boats, we're told, attacked the American fleet who were patrolling in the Gulf of Tonkin, specifically the USS Maddox, which was the lead ship. The commander of the USS Maddox was a gentleman by the name of Admiral George Morrison. You probably know his son better, Jim Morrison of the Doors. Just as a little piece of trivia. Now,
Laurel Canyon.
Oh dear, we could go on for days about Laurel Canyon. Laurel Canyon from Los Angeles. Check it out, guys, especially Dave
McGowan.
Dave McGowan. I was getting mixed up with Dave Keegan. Dave McGowan. The website, which is now maintained by his daughter, is called Center for an Informed America. CIA, get it? Never mind. And it's called Wagging the Moon Doggy. That's his series of articles. Very funny, very amusing, demonstrates that nobody's landed on the moon, which is my contention. One of the architects of the Vietnam War was the Defense Secretary at the time, Robert McNamara. He used to work for the Ford Motor Company, so he was good with numbers. Hence, we got all these numbers. Just before he died, I forget the year in which he died, but it was relatively recently. It's Robert McNamara. He said, he said, the American fleet was never attacked by torpedo boats. We made it up. What else are they made up? What else is going on? Moon landings. Oh, now people will say, well, I've seen it on television. It must be real. You can't fake that sort of stuff. Oh, yes, you can. Oh, yes, you can. I've seen gorillas climb the Empire State Building on television. I've seen dinosaurs chase kids around kitchens in Jurassic Park. I've seen men walk on the moon. Is that real? No, of course not. It's America. film technology at its finest. And if you want to see how it was done, there is a film that explains it all in detail. And it involves something called an optical printer. If you don't know what an optical printer is, check it out. An optical printer is a rather superior version of a photocopier, but for film. You project a film you've previously taken, you project a film, and it's then copied by 2, 3, or more other cameras using film. Or nowadays it uses video. But film was what was used at the time. Film can then be manipulated. If you have 144 frames per second film, which is high speed, and you take every 4th frame, you can show something not at high speed, but at normal speed, because normal photographic film cameras shoot at about 30 frames per second. Television cameras shoot about 24 frames per second. If you want to make something appear to move in slow motion, you use an optical printer from your original film and you make it look in slow motion. And if you look in detail, and the film is called Make Believe Smoke and Mirrors. Smoke and mirrors is a slang term for special effects. This film, quite a long film, but it's available if you want to look at it. Used to be on YouTube. It got taken down about 5 years ago because my talks got taken down. Everybody's talks talking about Apollo being fake got taken down. It was the 50th anniversary. We couldn't have any wrong stuff being talked about, could we? So they wiped them. But it's been archived and it's projected onto various other sites now.
You have it on Alice, right?
That's right, Alice.
Yeah, I have that website on the description of this, so wherever you may be listening to this, check that website out. I also have the Nexus, what is it, Nexus magazine online?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah,
Nexus.
I have that. Yeah, I put both of those links, so if there's any other links. But yeah, that video, Smoke and Mirrors, is right there. If you go right to that website, great video, and tons of resources. You'll never run out of resources if you really want to go in. And you wrote some of those documents?
Again?
You wrote some of those papers there on that site?
I've written some of the articles that appeared on Owlis, the Owlis website.
Right.
There are stories and articles there from people from around the world. You know, from Australia, that's Jarrah White. He writes a column on there. Interesting stuff. His most recent one is called the Sea Photograph, the Sea Rock Photograph.
Yeah.
The Sea Rock, where it's Apollo 16, where in the foreground of one picture, there's a rock, an average type rock, with the letter C on it. Oh, it's a hair caught in the camera. No, it wasn't. Jarrah White, who's a ferret in these things, he goes after them, and he was determined to demonstrate. I say prove and demonstrate are slightly different things, but I think he proved by his demonstration of tracking back where that photograph originated from, and was the C, a very distinct letter C, on that rock when it was first issued by NASA. Answer, yes, it was. He tracked it back to the day it was first published. So anyway, that's one of the things he does. Owlis carries articles from Russian filmmakers who try to recreate the Mythbusters show, to show that all us people who believed that Apollo was faked are wrong. No, we're not. Because they use the one thing which can be demonstrated quite easily to be incorrect. They went to the Apache Point Observatory lunar landing experiment. Lunar landing observatory experiment. Anyway, it spells Apollo, the name of this observatory, the Apache Point Observatory. They went there because if you fire a laser at the moon, it'll reflect back from the place it came from. That's the theory. So 3 Apollo missions, it was Apollo 12, Apollo 11, 12, and I think it was 14 or 15, I forget it. 3 missions put reflectors on the lunar surface, we're told. Oh, by the way, 2 Russian missions put reflectors on the lunar surface. So it's quite possible to do it remotely with an unmanned craft. So they went along and they watched the lady who was operating the laser, firing it up at the moon and getting reflection back. Well, that's fake because who was the first person, the first organization to fire a laser at the moon and get a reflection back? And when did it happen? Answer, Massachusetts Institute of Technology in May 1962. They did it. The Crimea Astrophysical Laboratory in Crimea, Soviet Union, did the same thing the following year. You don't need a mirror on the moon to get a reflection back. It'll reflect back. When you look out of the window at the moon, you see the moon. It's reflecting sunlight from the sun. Even if you can't see the sun, it's still reflecting sunlight. So the moon is reflective. You fire a laser at the moon, you get a reflection back. The British and American armies were doing this in the 1940s, firing radar signals and radio signals at the moon and getting a reflection back. If you have a big enough dish here on Earth to collect your laser signal, yes, you can record it. But how long does it take for enough photons from that laser being reflected off the moon to accumulate through your receiver for a signal to be identified? It doesn't just happen, because you can do the maths. And basically, the laser is 2 miles wide, 2 miles wide when it reaches the moon. The mirror is about half a square meter, half a square yard. So a very, very small proportion of the laser hitting the mirror is reflected back. How big is it, the laser, when it gets back to Earth? It's about 20 miles in diameter. You've got to have a whacking great receiver to get enough photons to record the signal. And it takes about 8 hours to record sufficient photons. You can calculate the number and the size and the number of zeros after the decimal point and before I think it's about 17 or 18 zeros is a percentage of the light coming back. So forget any instant reflection. It doesn't happen. That was fake. So all these mythbusters and people who claim to be able to do it, just do these tests, show it, and you'll find that you're not talking the truth. You're talking propaganda. You're repeating what NASA wants you to repeat. Your fellow travelers.
What? And I know it's getting late because you are 5 hours ahead of me, and I want to.
Oh, it's about just after 10:30 at night, so it's nice and quiet.
Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
I just don't want to hold you.
Because no, don't worry about that.
I know with the technical difficulties we had it earlier, I wasn't sure. I usually ask people how long do you have, so I don't step over people's toes. But yeah, if you're good, I'm more than good.
Let's go.
So what? Yeah, let's get after it. What would your answer be to someone? Because one of the common rebuttals I do or I hear from NASA apologists will be, especially when you bring up the radiation problem, that's a huge one that hasn't been solved. That's one of the issues why, or one of the problems that the Artemis program is trying to figure out, and that's why they keep postponing their stuff. But a lot of these NASA apologists that I believe aren't too educated on the matter, they just read a headline or two and they think they know it all. They'll say, well, we solved the radiation problem. That was solved long ago. And the radiation isn't a big deal in space because you can cut a hole if you go like at lunchtime. These are the things I've heard these NASA apologists, will say, if you go at a certain time during the day, you cut through it and it's not so bad there, blah, blah, blah. Well, let's say I'm this goofy NASA apologist coming at you with that silly answer. What would your response be to that?
just in terms of radiation, I would say, well, if you don't think radiation has a problem, just go outside when it's really sunny and hot and stand around in the sun for about 10 hours and see if you feel any sort of harm being done to your skin. When you go out in the sun, take your shirt off, do a bit of sunbathing all day, just do it all day. And then you can go to bed at night because obviously the sun goes down. Get out the next day, do the same thing. Nice and hot, 40 degrees, 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 40 odd degrees centigrade, Celsius, and tell me what you feel. Do you feel anything? And if you do, what's causing it? But it's obviously not the air around you. It's the sun causing it. That's called radiation. It comes in different wavelengths. It's nicely packaged. And the bits that you can see, i.e. visible light, what we use for walking around during the daytime, visible light, is just one part of what the sun produces. The sun produces light at various frequencies. Visible light is a tiny part of that. You've got ultraviolet light. You've got infrared light. You can use film to photograph something in infrared. Then you've got gamma rays. These are all invisible to us. We can't see them, but they exist. They're part of the electromagnetic spectrum. So when you get outside Earth, outside of the protection that we do have protection here on Earth. It's called our atmosphere. We have 60 miles of atmosphere above us here. Each square inch of that atmosphere weighs 14.7 pounds. It's pressing down on you. You don't feel it because your body is designed to withstand it, and it has internal pressure which equalizes it. You get outside Earth's atmosphere and go into space. The same frequencies from the sun exist in space, but there's no protection there. And there's something called the Van Allen radiation belts. They're about 500 or 600, more than that, 700 or 800 miles above Earth. That's where they start. The space shuttle, by the way, flies well below them, and they go out to about 25,000 miles from Earth. There are two belts, we're told. They're called the Van Allen radiation belts because they were identified and confirmed by Professor James Van Allen of Iowa University. And he had the very straightforward idea. He put a Geiger counter, which measures radiation. He put a Geiger counter on the first American rocket launched into space, called Explorer 1. And the Geiger counter started reading, because they had no idea what level of radiation they would find when they got there. They just wanted to know if it existed. Was radiation in space? Rocket goes up, Geiger counter starts reading. It's getting quite heavy, and then it stops. The whole thing stops. They found out later that the Geiger counter had been overloaded by the radiation. So the next time, Explorer 4, they sent another Geiger counter out, which had a much broader range of readings available to it. And James Van Allen said, when they got the readings back, space is radioactive. And if humans are going to fly into space, they had better establish a way of protecting them. Now, at this point, somebody will jump up and say, oh, he retracted that. No, he didn't. He worked with NASA, so he was defending NASA's position. He had to demonstrate through an email reply. This is not an official paper that he retracted anything in. It was an email. You don't publish emails as scientific papers to have them peer reviewed by anybody. So it may appear that he retracted. Anyway, there's radiation in space. And there are ways to protect us delicate little creatures, humans, from radiation. It's called lead or water. Surround yourself with lead. When you go and have your tooth x-rayed, you get the x-ray put alongside your jaw, and the technician operating it will be wearing a lead apron. And if he's a good technician, he'll give you a lead apron to wear as well. Lead protects humans against radiation, specifically X-rays. There are X-rays in space. Who knew? Well, they found out when they put the Geiger counter up, they're X-rays. Oh, but there's different types of radiation, we're told. Yes, there are. Gamma rays are one, X-rays are another. Electrons, photons, there's all sorts of nasties up there. Us delicate little creatures not very well designed to deal with them. We're designed to live here on Earth under our atmosphere, protected by our magnetic field, which is what creates the Van Allen radiation belts, the Earth's magnetic field. The moon doesn't have a magnetic field, so it just doesn't have any protection. So I thought, oh, bright idea coming up. This is about 20 years ago. I thought, I'll write to the people who make the spacesuits, a company called Hamilton Standard in Connecticut. What protection against radiation did you build into your spacesuits? We designed us and built the spacesuits based on the specification that NASA supplied us. That's understandable. It's what NASA were doing. They designed things and sent them off to companies to make them or build them. You better direct your question to NASA. I'm still waiting for the reply. So that's why they're having such trouble with Artemis. They sent 2 dummies on Artemis 1 called Helga and Zohar. They were strapped into the command module, covered with sensors, radiation detection. It's quite easy to detect radiation. I mean, a bit of photographic film will do it. It's sensitive to radiation. And they sent them up, and they got them back. And what was the result? It's classified. Oh, God. Well, why is a natural phenomena, radiation in space, why is that classified?
Natural or national security.
That's the answer to everything.
That's their answer for everything.
Yeah. If they can't give you a decent answer, national security will cover it. Because most people are patriotic. They understand national security. There are certain things you don't talk about. If you have enemies, you don't want to know about it. So you have national security, people who have access to, shall we say, secret information, i.e. how bombs work or how planes work or how far they can fly. That is national security. So you don't talk about it. And that's the way, most people would agree with that. I mean, we have the same thing.
Well, I would at some point, but once you see lie after lie after lie after lie, I no longer accept that, and therefore I make a joke out of it. Oh, yeah, I can't tell you that. It's a national security issue.
Yeah.
And you know, it's again, it's just more to the NASA fairy tale. You know, when I'm hearing you talking about the radiation, I go back to this morning when I was watching that video from 1966 where they're giving a tour of the LEM.
Yeah.
and they're pointing out the this little flimsy little piece of foil, and like, that's going to protect from, you know, from the heat, you know, in outer space. It's just so cheesy. And maybe at that point in time, it may have looked, you know, cool and amazing. But, you know, viewing it from the lens of today and all of our technological capabilities, it looks like hogwash. And every little bit of it, the computer systems that they have there, they had an AC cooling system. Wow. Way back then they had AC cooling, you know, and even in the inside they were showing the control panel where each astronaut could tune the AC to their liking. similar to what cars in 2024 can do. The passenger can do it their way and the driver can do it. Apparently they had the technology to do it then, but it disappeared for all these decades. It's just,
Yeah.
I'm going to send you the link and I hope you see it. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Maybe we could even do a show breaking it down the road.
I mean, one point you mentioned air conditioning.
Yeah.
Can't have air conditioning in space. It doesn't work. Space is a great insulator. So we have thermos flasks, because that little internal bit has got a vacuum in the middle. It's basically, there's no air. There's nothing for the heat in an air conditioning. Heat is taken from the room you want to cool down and dumped outside into the atmosphere on Earth. And there's plenty of atmosphere, so you can dump the heat. But in space, you can't dump the heat because space is an insulator. It's not an accumulator of heat. You've got to radiate it away. You can't use a vacuum. You can't use an air conditioning in space. And the only way you can get rid of the heat is to radiate it away. There are 3 types of heat transfer. There's conduction. Put your hand on a hot piece of wood in a fire. That's conducting heat into your hand, and it's very painful. Take it away. There's convection. If you've got a radiator that's warming the air inside a room, that's convecting the heat through the atmosphere. And you've got radiation. So when you go out in the sun, you feel it warm. That's radiant heat from the sun. If you stand in front of a campfire, big campfire, you feel the heat on your front. You don't feel it on your back. That's radiant energy. In space, you've only got radiant energy, and the only way you can get rid of heat in space is to radiate it away. And they did that, we're told, by allowing water to freeze, and when it then warmed up, it would take the heat away. Quite how it did it, and how much, you can calculate how much water is required to be evaporated away by the heat. It's a fairly straightforward formula. And you need to carry a lot more water than they did in their backpacks. Because a human body, when working at any reasonable degree of effort, will generate about 100 watts of energy. You can remove it, yes. But how much water do you need, we're told, in these PLSS, portable life support systems, the backpacks that the astronauts pranced around on the moon in? More than they could carry. The calculations have been done, but NASA will not address it. And the pro-NASA supporters are not willing to accept the answer. And like I said, I've seen gorillas climb the Empire State Building. I've seen men walk on the moon. It's all done by smoke and mirrors.
Wires. Yeah, it's I mean, you got to give it to them. The propaganda has been truly effective.
Yep.
Because, like I mentioned, still today, if you mention it, you're the one that is crazy for not believing these things that look obviously fake and extraordinary feats that were done in the 60s but can no longer be replicated. You're the one that's crazy. And they'll bring up, well, you're just incredulous, or they bring up all these different types of fallacies, which I find laughable, because again, they're the ones that made the claim. If you make the claim, you have to make a solid case, and I can choose to believe it or not. And so that's the way I look at it. But they'll turn around many times and act like you're the one that has to bring the evidence.
Yeah.
The evidence has already been established, as goofy and as silly as it has been presented out to be. I want to ask you, about the stars. That's one that sometimes gets addressed, sometimes doesn't. And NASA apologists will say, well, it's because of the exposure. But one of the thoughts that I had was I there was a debate with Toon and Dr. Raza, and one of the photos that was brought up was this underexposed picture. I don't know if I'm saying it right, under or overexposed, where everything is dark and then they lightened it up and now you could see the astronauts. The question I had was, okay, so it's under or overexposed. I'm not sure if I'm saying it correctly. And everything is dark. Shouldn't you see stars at that point in time?
You probably wouldn't, because
You
that
wouldn't?
no, because the
Okay.
explanation about why you don't see stars in the photographs, it's one of the ridiculous arguments put forward by people trying to put down anybody who questions Apollo. There are no stars in the photograph. Now, who was the first person who mentioned that as a problem? And nobody ever answers that question. The person who first mentioned it was Bill Casing in his book, We Never Went to the Moon. Why is it called We Never Went to the Moon? That was Bill Casing's book, published in 1976, 1977, somewhere around there, quite soon after Apollo had finished. We never went to the moon. Bill Casing was a writer, and he was concerned about, at that point, we're talking the early 1970s, veterans returning from Vietnam, very upset about what they were being asked to do, and also extremely angry at the reaction they were receiving from people in America. There was quite a lot of antagonism against those who had served in Vietnam. Bill Casing knew quite a lot of these people. He was a generous man, and he would give them accommodation if they couldn't find somewhere to live, that sort of thing. And he was discussing the moon landings. This was fairly soon after it had finished. Apollo 17 in 1972. Gene Cernan, Harrison Smith, the last men on the moon, we're told. And one of the veterans said to Bill, when they were discussing this, "Why didn't you write a book, Bill, and call it We Never Went to the Moon? That'll upset them." That's why it was called We Never Went to the Moon. That was his book, 1976. The next book to be published in this area was 1992 by Ralph Renee, NASA Mooned America. But go back to Bill Casing. He identified various problems, one of which was there were no stars in the photograph, and surely there should be stars in the photograph, he said. Now, it's been well established, I think, and having trained as a photographer and used a lot of film cameras, I would agree that you wouldn't see stars in a photograph if you expose it to illuminate, to photograph an astronaut wearing a white spacesuit on a fairly brightly illuminated surface. You wouldn't get the stars showing in the background. That's optics, and photographs and film. So he was not correct when he said that, but he was the first person to say it. And he then started talking about the waving flags. There are no waving flags on the moon. Of course there aren't. Even NASA's not that stupid. They know there's no wind on the moon, so the flag won't move. People had misinterpreted the photograph of the American flag on the moon that appeared to be flapping, and there's a film of it flapping. And that's when the astronaut has got hold of the flagpole on which it's attached and is trying to get it into the ground. It'll move, the flag will move. But what's interesting at that point is you can calculate the gravity by using the flag as a sort of pendulum to calculate the gravity at which that flag is being filmed. And it's Earth's gravity. End of story. That's why you can say it was all filmed on Earth. Because we know the difference between Earth's gravity and lunar gravity. And it's so big that you can't mistake it. It's 6 times stronger on Earth than it is on the moon. And then there's what's the third one they often come up with? I got so bored with looking. Oh, the 400,000 people who couldn't keep a secret. Yes.
You just bring up the Manhattan Project, and that shuts them right up. You know, Manhattan Project had 100,000 people working. They made a fake town. All the people in that fake town were passing off as bakers and you know, townspeople, but they were really working on the goddamn project, and they kept it a secret. So
Cool.
yeah.
Oh, what were they doing? Oh, that's what they were doing, making bombs. Exactly.
Yeah.
Anybody's interested, that's the book I've co-authored with Trevor Weaver, The Apollo Moon Hoax, The Real Evidence. And it looks at all these subjects. There's
Where can people get that book?
You get it on Amazon.
Amazon. Okay. Apollo Moon Hoax, for those listening, by Marcus Allen and Trevor Weaver. Apollo Moon Hoax, The Real Evidence. Get it on Amazon.
Yeah. Just opening
Yeah,
it.
for sure.
Let's see what one chapter. There's 29 chapters. Film in Space, chapter 20. And it goes into a lot of the detail we've already discussed. And there's the shadow angle. That's the thing that people normally do. Oh, the shadow angles, they're all wrong. No, they're not. Again, NASA would not be so stupid as to get the shadow angles wrong. Shadow angles on the moon are totally correct. Because I took part in a TV program about 15 years ago, where part of the program, I was being interviewed about photography and the photographs on the moon. And it was fortunate they actually brought a replica of the Hasselblad camera that is kept at Hasselblad UK. They borrowed it and I was able to examine it. I also photographed it. So I got photographs of the replica because there are none of the ones that were used on the moon are here on Earth because they got left on the moon. What a waste of a good camera. So I photographed the camera to show what I described earlier. You can't see it from inside your spacesuit. On that program, they then went all the way to America, because it was being made by a British company, went all the way to America and got an actor, dressed him up in a spacesuit, and got to I think it was the Mojave Desert they used, somewhere quite near Los Angeles anyway. And they got him to walk across the desert, and they had a huge, great artificial spotlight, 20K spotlight, generated by a generator in the camper van to show that the shadows wouldn't operate the way that they're shown in the Apollo photographs. And they don't, because they're illuminated by a light very much closer to the subject. I mean, 20 kilowatt light, it sounds very powerful. It is quite powerful, but it falls off quite soon. Anyway, this poor little chap in his hot little spacesuit at night, so you get a black sky. Why do you bother to do it at night? Why not wait till the sun comes up? You get much better pictures that way, because you don't need night to photograph a black sky. If you're using film, you can do it in the camera. You can make the sky, you can use filters to cut out the blue light, or the red light, or the yellow light, any light you want. You can get filters for it. Get polarizing filters, which change the way the film records frequencies of light. So you've got all these things. Anyway, the film showed it, and they had some chap on it who was supposedly an expert in space travel, examine it and say, well, of course, this proves it was all, what these people are saying is all complete nonsense. No, it doesn't. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's not a photographer. He claims to be a space expert. I think his name was Jay Utah or something like that, because he lived in Utah City, Salt Lake.
Salt Lake City, Utah.
Yeah.
Home of the Mormons.
Well, nice people, the Mormons.
Yeah, I lived there 20 years. Crazy, wild beliefs, in my opinion, but good people.
Yes.
Yeah,
Right.
I think, gosh, I want to say Utah played a role in the space race as well. I think they were, kind of like what you were talking about earlier, how they were building this part here and building that part there. And I think Utah, if I'm not mistaken, was another location, but I can't remember if that's accurate or not. Maybe it was something else. Maybe it was for the another event. I know they played a role somewhere. So I'll have to fact check myself on that. I don't want to spread misinformation.
That's quite close to Arizona, isn't it? I mean, I haven't been to America, so
Yeah,
I am.
so if you can picture California,
Yeah.
and then if you head east from California, you have Nevada,
Yeah.
and right after Nevada, you have Utah borders. So a lot of people that live in Salt Lake City, Utah, the ones that aren't Mormon and they want to do some gambling, they just make what is it, a 4-hour drive to the border of Nevada, and you can gamble there. As soon as you get to that state line, the
Yeah.
laws change and you can actually gamble. So that's what some people do. Or you can drive 6 hours to Las Vegas.
Oh,
So yeah,
it'd be a great visit. It's one of the places I'd love to visit. I don't know if I ever
I'd
will.
love to visit the UK.
You're very welcome. We speak the same language. Oh,
Yeah,
yes.
we do.
Why do you speak English in America and not French or Spanish?
Because of your ancestors.
There were plenty of Spanish people there. The French were occupying a lot of America as well. I mean, you got Quebec up in Canada.
Well, I'm
That's-
Mexican American, so I'm mixed. I've got Indian blood as well as Spanish blood, and apparently, from the Spanish side of my family, the first conquistador, side of my family, landed in Mexico in 1540.
Wow.
Yeah, 1540.
That's-
So a little bit of history for sure, even on my European side, and then obviously the indigenous side has been here millennia. So yeah, I'm fascinated with a lot of these things.
Yeah.
Whether it's Mesoamerican history, I've dug into that. You'll have some people say, well, yeah, when the Europeans got here, there was nothing that existed. I'm like, you obviously don't know anything about the Aztec Empire or the Mayan or even the Olmec civilization, which the Aztecs looked at as ancients before them. The Olmec fascinate me in many ways because you'll have different camps of people saying the Olmecs look like Africans. You'll say some people say the Olmecs statues resemble Polynesians. And then you have other folks that say, no, the Olmecs resemble the people indigenous to Mexico today. And
True.
there's I've come to my own little theory just based on a bunch of stuff, and I'd like to know what you think about it. I wonder, we briefly talked about the Egyptians and how advanced they were, and they were a civilization that wasn't monolithic. Different peoples came in and went, for sure. But I wonder if at some point some very talented engineers, Egyptian engineers, maybe decided to navigate across the Atlantic and maybe landed in Mexico, maybe showed some primitive pyramid building to the natives there, and with some basic technology, they took off and made their own style. That's why the pyramids in Mexico look different from the Egyptians. They were shown the basics, and then they engineered their own stuff. Because a lot of people forget, when you see something magnificent, as whether it's the Mesoamerican pyramids or the Egyptian pyramids, it's not like they just built them overnight. This was a process that took many, many years, maybe even millennia, to get to that point. So they're already old as they are, but you also have to realize that the idea probably sprang up many, many hundreds of years, if not thousands of years prior to those edifices being erected. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would say just look at the number of pyramids in Egypt, which is 118. You can check it out. That is not even greater than the number of pyramids in the country directly to the south of Egypt. We now call it the Sudan. There's nearly 200 pyramids in the Sudan. How many people know about the pyramids in China or Cambodia, or as you've already said, in Mesoamerica? There are pyramids all over the world.
Everywhere.
Everywhere. There are hundreds of them. all around the world.
There's even mounds in the Ohio Valley, out here in what is known as America. The Ohio mounds, snake mounds, I believe, near Louisiana. These are structures built by the indigenous folks of America, and no one really knows what their purposes were, or what they served as. What fascinates me with the ancients is their knowledge of astronomy. The Mayans, that the Mayans, if you're a flat earther, the Mayans are I would investigate them deeply, because the Mayans were flat earthers. And people like to say, well, all the ancients believed in a sphere, not the Mayans. The Mayans were flat earthers, and you can't dispute their astronomical achievements. I mean, their calendars were on point many, many centuries down the road. And so again, I don't believe in flat earth, but if I was a flat earth believer, I would really, really study the Mayan civilization. And
Good point. Yeah.
That's just that's something. But it's really interesting how these ancients were able to map out the stars. And obviously they didn't have the light pollution that we have to deal with today, living in big cities. And so that's definitely a hindrance. So you have to assume that their skies were just super clear. And when you don't have TV at night and that's all you're looking at is the skies and observing it, I'm assuming that helps out as well. That's the thing with today. We may be advanced in some ways, but we've lost basic abilities. How to navigate if you get lost. If you don't have a GPS or a phone and you get lost in the woods, how are you going to get out of there? And that's something that some of these people that we would deem quote unquote primitive, they wouldn't have an issue. They know how to navigate the skies and go north, east, west. And if something catastrophic were to happen, I don't know if you ascribe to the younger Dryas impact theory, but maybe something along those lines, or maybe we just do it to ourselves through a nuclear war, where we're just destroying each other. That could happen. That could very, very realistically happen. And if that were to happen, a lot of people would get wiped out, because they wouldn't know how to take care of themselves. Firstly, they wouldn't know how to sustain themselves, how to live off the land. It's just these basic things that we've lost, and people just walk around with their heads down, looking at their damn phones. And you have to wonder if that's being pushed on us, being done on purpose for that reason, to keep us ignorant, in case they're trying to push something bigger, and wipe a certain percentage of the population. What are your thoughts when it comes to that?
I don't go along with that to the extent. There's one question I would normally ask anybody who says, "Oh, they are doing this, they are doing that." Who are they? And I always say, can you name one person who you consider to be they? And they'll come up with Klaus Schwab or Bill Gates.
No, I think those guys are puppets. I would say those guys are puppets, like Bill Gates, Klaus Schwab. I don't think they're extra power. Jeff Epstein. I would say there's people that I mean, look at the start of the Federal Reserve in America. It's like a Hollywood script.
Yeah.
You had these rich elites, the Rockefellers, the Pierponts, that were met at a secret island in Jekyll Island, where they talked about what kind of laws they were going to lobby for to get passed, and so that they could print the money, they could run it. So, I mean, it sounds nefarious. It sounds like straight out of a comic book, but that's what really happened. That's how the Federal Reserve was created. So I think a lot of these people behind those, the plans get kicked down the road, and so there's different faces, but the puppet masters have no names. Well, you and I will never know who these puppet masters are, but and maybe you disagree with it, but that's the way I view it. I think there are people, there are powers in control that we just don't know who they are. All I can point out is there's weird stuff happening. There's patterns that appear to be repeated over and over, and that's where I go off of. I don't claim to know exactly why or who or when. I just observe is really what I do.
Yeah, that's the way it should be. Observing it, trying to work out the answers. I mean, that's what I've been doing for 60 years, trying to work out the answers. I don't have them all. I have a few, but not all of them. I mean, one question I ask anybody, we talk about Federal Reserve. I say, the Federal Reserve is a private company.
Yeah, it's not even it's not federal at all. It's no different than the Bank of England.
Exactly. And that's
yeah.
And the Bank of England was set up deliberately to provide finance to the king to go and invade somewhere. That's why Britain has a record of invasion of other countries. I think there are only 10 countries in the world out of 195 that exist in the UN today. Only 10 countries that Britain hasn't invaded, attacked, or generally misbehaved with. Mongolia being one of them. That's about the only one I could think of. But Britain had to have finance, because this people talk about finance without really understanding what it means.
Yeah, you can ask anyone what is the simple question, what is money? Such a simple question, but a lot of people can't answer that.
Well,
they'll come up, it grows on trees, you'll get answers like that.
Big money tree, yes. But if you're going to finance a war, what is the finance actually for? Where does the finance go from the people who supply it to the people who use it? It goes to one place and one place only. It goes to pay somebody, to pay a soldier, an airman, a naval. It goes to pay somebody. So if you say this war is costing us £5 billion a year, you can calculate how many people are involved. You say, no, that can't be right, because you got to get the guns. Yes, you've got to pay somebody to make them. You've got to get the planes. Yes, you've got to pay somebody to make them. Maybe they're not in the army or the Air Force, but they buy planes and guns from people who make them. So you've got to pay them. So all the money goes to pay somebody. That's all it ever does. If you say America lost, was that famous comment on September the 10th, 2001?
$2.3 trillion.
3 trillion we can't account for.
Can't account for it. And then the next day, allegedly one of those planes hits the accounting department of the Pentagon. So whoops, we can't account for it anymore. I'm sorry, please forgive us.
And of course, those planes were flying so fast, weren't they? They hit the building, go straight. A plane can't fly at 500 miles an hour at sea level.
It'll break apart. It'll fall apart in the air. I mean, the whole story is funny, but I mean, even there was an article that came out a few years ago from Forbes magazine where 21 trillion went missing, unaccounted for. The CIA was going to get to the bottom of it. They were going, and that was the only news article that ever came out of it. $21 trillion is more than several countries' GDP, and it just goes missing. And so this gets to my next question for you. So we're on the same page that man didn't land on the moon. So what's the purpose of NASA? I view it as money laundering, more money laundering for black operations across the world. I mean, it may sound far-fetched, but then you look at Iran-Contra and what was discovered through that, through Gary Webb's work, where under the Reagan administration, because a lot of people will say Reagan was the last great president. Well, let's go. Hold up, slow down. Let's talk about Iran-Contra. It flourished under his administration, and although he okayed it, he didn't want any federal funds being used for these covert operations. So the CIA said, "Shit, we'll turn into drug trafficking and raise money that way." And they raised a hell of a lot of money, and they destabilized a hell of many countries. And in my opinion, installing puppet presidents in light of all that. So, and again, this all ties in. These are the puppet masters. It's people that we don't know. We don't know their names. They follow order, and it's all, there's, anytime you see some big name coming down, whether it's Jeff Epstein, for example, or El Chapo, those are just the faces. There's bigger names behind them,
It's interesting you mentioned Epstein.